Hey, I'm Hiko, the master baiter, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Daring Minds, the third one at that, because we only did two before. That's how it works. That's how episodes work, in case people aren't aware. It's not complicated, though. It ain't like it's not like Game of Thrones. You don't have to have watched episode 1 and 2. But I would say 2 was pretty good, actually. Sideshow had some interesting insights, as you'd expect. I actually, personally, one thing I was very interested by is I thought it was funny that, to me, because I'm from CS, to me, Valorant just looks like some sort of fucked up version of Overwatch. But to him coming from Overwatch, he's like, this is more like CS. It's like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like some sort of mad, like that old school commercial dusT will know of, like the fucking, oh, you've got your peanut butter in my chocolate, but my chocolate's in your peanut butter. It's like, it was like that fucking, I think it was the Family Guy rip-off version of it, but everyone remembers it if you're enough of a boomer. So obviously our guest for this one is going to be dusT, who is technically available for work in Valorant if people have any good events. He wants to do them. He likes the game. He does follow it. He does his homework. And look at, what more do you want? I'm giving him a good rep. Giving him a good fucking review here. He's pretty good. Also does CS as well, by the way. If you're from CS and you're going, oh, it's just still around. He's available also for CSGO. That's right. You can hire him for that game too. And also, by the way, just a random thing I'll put out there. Listen, I'm not trying to make it sound dress, but he also will do talk shows. If you ask him, he'll do them as long as they're good.
So versatile.
Exactly. Just available. That's all you need to know. If you're wondering about dusT, status available. Now then, with that said, that could go so many ways, but we'll leave that for now. We'll just keep that nice and let's just temper it down.
Yeah.
But here's why I do want to start though, dusT. Along those lines of the joke I was saying there about me and side shots, I want to get your perspective actually, because you're someone, if people don't know, now Valorant's been out a couple of years. I mean, people forget that like the beta was coming out at like the beginning of when we were all going online. If people remember, in like it was in like spring of 2020, I think, from what I remember. Right now, Valorant's been out long enough. You've been doing events in it. You've basically now done you're one of the few people for me who's like properly done CS and Valorant. You haven't just like done a bit of one and then skipped over, or you weren't like, you knew a bit about CS but you were off in, either get like Geo's games, the people who are over in all the other League of Legends, some people even came from. What's your perception thus far been of Valorant, dusT? Like, how do you frame it as a game? What do you enjoy about it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I enjoy about Valorant is it has a lot of the tactical FPS elements that CSGO has that I enjoyed, as far as like just, the basics of strategy, right? It's still a lot about, bomb sites, map control, executes, setting up your retakes and your post plants and things of that nature. So it has a lot of like those core fundamentals of attack FPS for this type of game mode, which I really enjoy. But really what happens, with Valorant that you didn't see in CS is that you have meta shifts. Like, you actually have things to track over time, which stops it from being stale. Like, you aren't just reliant upon new maps or something like that in order to spice things up. And you still have all these progressing storylines from teams and players and tournaments and things of that nature. I wish we had more international events. That's like the one thing I don't like about it is we don't get to see the international mix up as much as I would like to see throughout the course of a year. But in general, you get a lot of those things, a lot of those basics. But yeah, you just get like different ways of executing, right? Different ways you can layer abilities rather than just relying on base utility, from a game like CS. And so, yeah, I just like that I get a lot of the same tactical stuff that I enjoyed from Counter-Strike. You even had some of the same players coming over, providing some of those historical storylines. And yeah, it's a lot of fun, man. Like, I really enjoy watching how teams decide to create compositions and what strategies they try to bring to the table and how they work together. It's really enjoyable and beautiful, really, to watch how people can sync up certain things to make plays happen, and kind of tracking that over time.
By the way, Gio, I don't know that much about Rainbow Six. I've seen like the odd match. Is that actually a game where it's more akin to CS and the general meta of the game stays quite similar for a while and small? Or is it more akin to these games where there's the big meta shift and you put in new things, take out old things? What was Rainbow Six like in that sense?
Rainbow Six has meta shifts, yeah, definitely. In my opinion, the meta shifts, so obviously the two big games that I've come from before were Overwatch and then Rainbow Six. So for me, like, my experience was Rainbow Six's meta shifts were a bit more subtle than they were in Overwatch. In Overwatch, it would be like very, very stark meta shifts. I mean, you'll remember. Rainbow Six, I think the other thing that is kind of involved in Rainbow Six that can do meta changes even outside of patches and stuff is the fact that like operator is the name for like heroes, agents, characters, whatever. Operator bans exist in Rainbow Six, so kind of similarly to like how it is in League. It's not as many as League of Legends. You don't have a whole draft pick where you're like doing a million different characters, but you have that in Rainbow Six. So when things start to get figured out and a certain meta does come in, like then teams are going to realize actually we should be banning this operator out and denying that to be played, which is going to change the way it's played. So I would say that the meta shifts in Rainbow Six are a little bit more fluid, and then when patches come in, it definitely affects it, but it's sort of more subtle. But I feel like it's more of a gradual, ever-changing thing in Rainbow Six. But obviously, Rainbow Six being it is a tactical shooter, and the very unique thing about Rainbow Six is the fact you have all this map destruction. So the map is literally never the same in any two like rounds or any two games or whatever. So you're constantly working with a different environment, which is what makes Rainbow Six so freaking difficult. But you also have like each character has their own individual like abilities, and actually unlike CS and Valorant, and slightly more similarly to Overwatch, although in a less cartoony way, you do have like character A can choose between weapon 1 and weapon 2. Character B can have weapon 3 or weapon 4. Like it's not like there's a pool of weapons and anyone can choose what they want and whatever. Okay. So there is the limitation in that, which obviously like plays into that kind of hero shooter sort of style, and that has a big impact in meta shift. But also it's still round based, similarly to CS and Valorant. There's no economy in it, and you have those the operator bans.
Because if people don't know, I actually find it very interesting when people have never come from the games, because it's more the old school games, if you notice, like Counter-Strike, StarCraft was a classic one back in the day. You can't really say things like Dota anymore because they've actually gone the opposite direction in terms of balancing. But basically, if you come from the games where it's not like the game dev drastically has a meta shift, like tells you, like, I'm just going to switch things up. Because basically, Overwatch was probably one of the most extreme examples. For me, Overwatch and League of Legends, what they typically tend to do is, true, they're just balancing the characters, but in doing so, it causes shifts where like one role goes from like most important to least important. And obviously you can imagine on the esports / competitive side that that's an enormous difference. Because I always tell people, imagine if you were trying to make like a Premier League team in football, and then all of a sudden tomorrow, like strikers no longer are an important piece. And like now it was all about having like the central defender or something, but your team was like the one with all the strikers and the wingers. Like it would mean that as a GM, you'd be like, how am I supposed to do this job? Like, how am I supposed to have the right players? So the interesting thing for me is, when you have a game like that, though, in Counter-Strike, it's not that there isn't meta shifts. It's just that the meta shifts come from things that are external to the game. So they come from, for example, like essentially, once the meta gets set and teams kind of know how good each other are, you actually just change teams to get better at the game. Like you address it that way, you know, like this team, like I'll give you an example, when Na'Vi became the top team last year and they were just too good for everyone, all the other teams just recruited like more skilled players to try and like even out that disparity in that area of the game they felt like they were lacking, you know. So it's more like the scene adapts, I would say, to the game and tries to get the edge, because it's just competitors trying to one up each other. It's not the game sort of telling you this is stronger, this is weaker. But the reason why it's interesting to me is because obviously right now we have a topic we can tie into that's very current, which is everyone who's an NA fan is obviously going to be watching the VCT NA qualifier, right? And we're at that challenges, and we're obviously at the point now where we've got all the big names there, but, and this is a key difference if you're coming from other games, is it's essentially not just going to be how good are these teams, it's all going to be how good are they at this current meta shift now and the new patch, right? So a little bit of this is going to have to be speculation, and we're going to have to imagine and theory craft a little bit. So dusT, what do you think? What situation are we walking into here? Like, this is the controller meta shift, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, obviously we're in a situation prior to this where Astra reigned supreme just because she had so much impact on the game, because her star placement was just so easy to do. It's global. She had so many of them. The Gravwells could literally just do a plethora of different things throughout the course of the game, whether it was deny timings early round, disrupt the fuses or something like that. Just had so much impact on the game from just one character. And so literally everyone was kind of just forced to eventually adopt Astra. Some people were slower than others to do so, and there were some advantages that were gained by teams who were early adopters. Viper obviously was also very prevalent. In some situations you'd play both, like Bind, for instance, is a map that both would kind of get played out. I think Icebox and Breeze were like the only maps where you didn't really play Astra and you kind of just focus more on Viper solo. And so you really had that going on for quite some time. And so teams that were a little bit better at just maximizing that utility and just being kind of like at that pace where you can kind of just craft everything out, we're doing really well. And people who were more reliant on like playmaking controllers were kind of like slipping up a little bit, and took a little bit of time for them to adjust. But now we're getting to a point where that's going to pivot back, where, you know, there is still some use for Astra. I still have some teams make Astra work in this patch, but a lot of it is going more towards like playmaking controllers, like an Omen or a Brimstone. And Viper still has her place on certain maps like she did before, but you're really starting to see these like more kind of like playmaking, so to speak, with like, you know, Brim stemmies or with Omen's teleports and things of that nature, where you kind of get a little bit more aggressive from the controller role. And I think overall the pacing is going to be a bit faster because you aren't going to have those grav wells disrupting timings. You aren't going to have those sorts of things. And so it could favor teams that are a bit scrappier and aren't on reliant on like heavy utility play. But we'll have to see how that develops, right? Certainly some of these guys have already played Omen and Brimstone in the past because they've been around the game for that long, and the core of the team's been together since that time was. But you have some newer teams like, let's say, the Guard, where we haven't seen them play in a meta like that. And it's like, do they keep up? Because they've been shockingly good so far throughout VCT underneath like the Astra meta. And it's like, that's the one team I think personally I'm the most curious about going forward.
Oh, don't worry, we're definitely going to get into that. But the question here is, let's just do this, Gio. Since we're going to do both at once, let's try and dusT did like the brief version. Let's do a longer version, essentially, in talking about the meta shift. Let's figure out which teams are going to potentially be hit by this, and who's going to potentially get the sort of the buff, as it were. Who would you initially put forwards for this? Like who has a strong Astra, for example?
Starting with, well, actually, I think the bit I want to start with is who would I expect to get the buff? Because so far we've seen one weekend of play in NA on this new patch. And the team that I thought would get the biggest buff did not actually show that. And so they're going to be someone I'm keeping a really close eye on in playoffs to see if they do get that. And that's Sentinels. Because Sentinels very famously have this style that dusT was just describing, which is that like they want to play more on the fly. They've never been really great at site setup. They were the dominant team in the first half of 2021. And then when Astra came in at the beginning of stage 3, and that's when teams started adopting her and this new playstyle of very stringent site setup, that's where they started to fall off because they didn't adapt their playstyle to fit that, and their playstyle that had always worked for them just didn't really work so great in that meta. So my assumption was like, awesome, like Sentinels, this is their playstyle. They've been very stubborn about sticking to that. This should work great for them because it's going to favor like faster site hits. It's not just about, you know, the example dusT gave was like, you know, being able to use grav wells to disrupt the flow of things. And for those who don't know, a grav well is like basically a big black hole thing. It'll just suck you and route you to one spot. But it's also about having fewer smokes available to cut off lines of sight. If you're not going to be bringing a Viper anymore on a lot of these maps, then you're not going to have a wall to cut half of the site in half. So a lot of lines of sight that will provide you with a relative impunity to actually take a site, no longer an availability. So you will have to play faster and you will have to be more aggressive, more decisive. And that is something that Sentinels, in theory, should be able to really thrive off of with ShahZaM's kind of like mid-round calls and his ability to direct the action as it's happening. But they actually still had like a pretty rough game this week. There were some good things that I spotted in terms of like their ability to have a good stream of utility in the late round if they get that far. But I still think that they didn't show that they were good enough at being able to set up and support tens for him to really get much value. And really, you need your duelist to be getting a ton of value if you want to be making fast site hits. So they're a team that I think will should, in theory, on paper, get a buff from this meta, but so far I'm going to have to see a couple more games before that's proven to me. As for teams that I think will stay doing things well on Astra, so the team that actually stood out to me quite a lot this weekend from that perspective was XSET. When they were playing against Luminosity, they actually, and I'm specifically talking about their split map here, so there have been a number of games where like teams have still had very similar compositions and it's been very minor changes. This was a map where there were very different compositions on each team, and Luminosity really lent into like this new idea. They brought the Omen, they brought Sage and Cypher instead of having the classic Astra Viper, but XSET stuck with the Astra Viper. And the really big thing that like you noticed is that while they're playing those same agents that aren't necessarily the favored agents now, the way they play them is different. And I think those teams who are going to be quick to adapt their play, if they really want to stick with Astra Viper, they're going to have to be the ones who are proving that they can adapt their play style to, tackle what this new way of playing is going to be, rather than sticking to the previous play style of them. So, for example, we saw a lot of focus in mid, because like the mid section of the map was just basically needed for any kind of real take on either of the sites to be done by the attackers. And then they would have like a chamber anchor on one of the sites. So you're actually using an operator to anchor onto a site and then have all the utility in mid, because you don't have as many Astra Stars available in theory, because the cooldown is so much higher, to place all around the map. So let's focus and consolidate onto this one really key part of the map and make it really difficult and expensive from a utility perspective for an attacker to actually fight into that. Similarly, when we saw the Guard playing against Cloud9 this weekend, they were playing Astra on the Ascent map, and in like a post plant, for example, rather than placing smokes around different entry points into the map, they would place a smoke in the middle of the site to play around with angles, because it's how you can like get value out of like the lower number of resources that you have available to you. So I think it's those teams that are showing they can change the way that they play on Astra are the ones that I feel like would still do well to keep playing her.
Sure. Right, obviously dusT, that's open-ended there. Jump in any way you want, mate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly, I think there's a lot of teams that to me are just going to be good no matter what, because they're just flexible enough teams. You know, for example, a team like Cloud9 has been strong for so long. And if anything, I think that this meta shift could actually make them even better, because Vanity is a more aggressive guy. Like, he's a guy that likes to be a playmaker. He likes to be in the pocket. And so, you know, when he had to play Astra, it kind of forces you to be a little bit more reserved and passive, because you need to make sure you're alive long enough to get your utility in place to set up your teammates, where now you put him on an Omen, you put him on a Brimstone. He was already flirting with those agents anyway on certain maps during the previous meta.
He was a big Omen player before, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if anything, you're kind of playing into his hands and allowing his play style to thrive a little bit more. You know, with Optic, it's kind of interesting because you're seeing Finesse like even sometimes flex off of certain controllers, and certain other people are playing them instead. So I think it gives them a little bit of variability. I think someone like Xander is just such a gifted individual player that being able to put him on more, let's say, aggressive controllers is probably going to open up his play a little bit as well. Though we have still seen him play Astra on some maps, and they've been able to make that work. I think version 1's been one of the other like big teams next to the Guard this year that has really just impressed with how they've been able to construct their team and how things are going to get going. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of the teams that are still good, I don't think this is like a drastic enough shift in how the game is played to where they're suddenly just going to fall off the face of the earth or something like that. Like, I think pretty much the top 5 in NA is going to remain the top 5. I just think that a team like the Guard that already had a really small sample size as far as like how good they truly are, this is what I'm most curious about. Just to see how it's going to play out with this new meta shift. But I have faith that it will probably be fine, because I think their coaching is just really good. Like, I think MCE is one of those guys that's kind of like, you know, he calls himself the mad scientist. Like, he always wants to try new things. He's always wanting to experiment in scrims and things of that nature. And so I think that he's the type of guy who's open-minded and adaptable enough to figure out ways to make this thing work. It's just maybe about Valen as an individual. Like, what does he feel comfortable playing? Because, you know, some of these guys are just emerging now. Yeah, they've played in the past, but on smaller name teams. Someone like Trent came literally out of nowhere. So it'll be interesting to see like how those guys perform, because we just don't know. Like, we just haven't seen them go through a shift like this before as a team.
I think what you said about Valen there is something that I was thinking as well, is like, for me, the question is not necessarily like, are the Guard going to be able to be good enough to like play these this different meta, but more like Valen being a relatively fresh young IGL has always been used to IGLing on Astra, where that is a very like kind of slightly further back, more passive to the literally like the experience of playing her is more passive. You have way more global oversight of the map, because that's the whole point of why you would even pick her and what she provides. So if he were to switch over to like an Omen or a Brim, he's going to be way more like finding himself in that fray. Is that going to affect his, the efficacy of his IGLing? Because suddenly what he has to think about and the vision and the view he has over everything that's happening has changed.
Yeah, actually an interesting detail we could bring up on that topic is In the history of Counter-Strike, there's a very interesting shift that we actually had with what the in-game leader typically does in terms of what role he does in competitive CS, which is back in the day, actually, it was more in line with what you're talking about here when the Astra exists, that essentially the IGL back in the day, the premise went he should be one of the people going in last because he needs to be alive to call everything. He wants to potentially not be taking a fight so he can look at people's monitors, talk to them, take information in, make reads, whereas actually in the modern day, you'll find most of the top teams, it's in part due to like essentially sort of like firepower distribution. Like usually your in-game leader's not as good a fragger, so you also try and use him on a role where he doesn't have to like get big kills. In the modern day, actually, a lot of the good IGLs are part of the entry pack essentially, and it's more like they just set up like the mid round and then they're going in with the pack, so they can actually like, first of all, there's one less person to worry about. Is one thing I always say because you can just do part of it yourself, and then secondly, they're just such wizards at the game. They just don't need as much brain power always to call all the things, and they trust that their teammates know it all. So I think that what you're setting up here, actually, I think that in itself sounds like it could be an enormous difference in the meta shift, which is what about the IGLs who want to sort of sit back and call the game, or what about the people where maybe their skill sets are more actually getting kills themselves, getting in the action, just essentially just being another skilled player. Yeah, what teams do you think would be affected in this sense, dusT? Who would fit this kind of bill?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because I feel like in a lot of situations, teams have kind of been varied on where their IGL sits. Like, I feel like a lot of teams, typically their IGL is like a Sova. I feel like that's happened for a lot of teams. But also, you've had a lot of teams that have chosen their controller player to be that type of play, like, you know, someone like Vanity on Cloud9, for instance, or like Xander on version 1 have done it from the controller role. Same with dusT, I suppose. And you've also seen some teams kind of do it from more of like the Sentinel role. Like I think of Finesse from Optic or something like that, who's kind of known as like being like the Killjoy Cypher person doing the in-game leading. You don't see usually very many like star players, obviously, like playing like a duelist role. They're taking over that goal, kind of just for what you said. Like you want to be able to focus on taking those open engagements and not micromanaging people while you're looking for a pick or something like that. And so, yeah, it has been interesting to see how it varies it up. But yeah, you're generally right. Like generally, the in-game leader is going to be more of a guy who's setting up the utility, who is a little bit more back, so to speak. That way that they can focus more on kind of orchestrating the round and things like that. And I think that also really just comes down to the style of the team, though. Like how much individual freedom are you giving? You know, how much are you reliant upon you know, calling things on the fly and mid-rounding as opposed to teams who like these like really orchestrated setups and set pieces when they go to attack. I think that also kind of changes things. You know, for example, if you're someone like Vanity and you're someone like Cloud9, whose core strength, in my opinion, is their adaptability in the mid-round, is their ability to do things on the fly and call pivots, then if you're someone like Vanity playing like a more aggressive controller, then, you know, that's not really going to impact you at all. You're going to be able to still play to those strengths or something like that. Whereas if you're a team like the Guard, who honestly, I think their biggest strengths was on defense. They were incredibly good at how they did like these like little set aggressive defensive plays to kind of jab at a team and like force them back and deny map control and kind of disrupt them, or some of their just like really explosive high utility executes on sites. You know, so that's a team, again, just because of also the small sample size and not going through a meta shift before, or I'm a little bit more curious how they would adapt their in-game leading in a situation like this.
Okay. Do you have any other people where, because obviously you gave like a couple of examples there, Gio. Do you have any other people where you could see like the contrast of what we should look for, like whether it affects the team setup or not?
Let me
any
think.
obvious examples, you know?
So I think that, okay, so dusT mentioned version 1 being very good. I think they're going to be a team who can handle this meta change very, very well. And the big question, I think, for a lot of people was whether Xander, who, you know, how him switching like controllers was gonna make like a ton of difference, and him going to Omen. And I think that so the map that they played Omen on this week was Haven, and that was a map that version 1 just absolutely were incredible on, and not a single person on that map played poorly. So for me, I have high hopes for how version 1 are gonna be playing in this meta. I think that LG are
was that the game where you retweeted that like mental clip where that guy did the ace? Yeah,
I know, I was like screaming.
I mainly just remember it because of your ridiculous reaction. Yeah, not even the kills, but it was pretty good.
Yeah.
It was pretty good.
No, that was nuts. And I think that, you know, part of their success on that map, it wasn't just about like control. Like Xander did play very well, but a lot of that was because of how Effie's played Breach. Breach and Sentinels not necessarily having a really solid idea on how to deal with that. I think Breach on Haven it's definitely a stylistic choice, but I'm a really big fan of it. But I think that LG, a team that I'm going to be looking out for as well. I actually don't expect LG to go super far in the playoffs. I think they're one of these teams that's like, cool, you made it, but like you're probably gonna, get first rounded. Just use it as a learning opportunity. But the fact that they were willing to kind of lean into coming up with some creative ideas, and Tig, who is again like a pretty solid Astra player, he was very happy to jump onto the Omen, and there was some really like interesting just pieces of Omen utility that I saw this team use, and how they would like use his teleport to specifically like set up like a pinch situation in a post plan onto like attackers who are trying to like watch the spike and prevent the defenders from coming back in, things like that. I have my issues with some of the ways that LG play. I'm not the biggest fan of the way that Marta plays KO, for example, and I think being able to play KO really well right now is a very important part of how to play Valorant well. But I think that seeing them try to be kind of innovative in some of their decision making, there's someone who I think will probably not like have it straight away and be amazing or be really poor, but I think that there'll be a team who are willing to try and push the boat to see what they can do with the new space that's being built.
dusT, one thing I want to ask you about is on the last couple of episodes, because generally we focus on A, because spoiler, anyone who's ever followed the socials will know this, Gio sort of likes LA and might want to live there one day. I don't know if she's ever mentioned it or anything, guys. Like, maybe once or twice. Exactly, yeah. So basically, like the joke is this entire show essentially is just get Gio a job in America, hopefully doing VCT. So I don't want to reveal the whole, the hidden man behind the curtain, but that is just what's going on with the Wizard of Oz setup here. But get back into the show. Here's the question, right, dusT? On the first two episodes, as a result, you can imagine a lot of our focus has been on teams like Sentinels, 100 Thieves, the big names in NA that you talk around, with all the big personalities and the drama. But one thing I wanted to get your take on, because I was very interested in this myself, but I wanted to get a CSGO person to ask about this, is, dude, I used to say this in a derogatory fashion, so I'll do it in Thorin fashion. Like, when people last year, for example, would ask me, like, so when are you coming to Valorant? And spoiler, I'm not actually in Valorant yet. I'm just doing a show, as I said, to help Gio pop off, hopefully. But let's pretend I am, right? When I would be like, well, I'll probably never come into Valorant. One of the reasons why, even though the real reasons why is it's just not as good a game as CS, it's not no hate on the game. Like, I would always say it just to be silly. Like, well, isn't it a game where, like, they're telling me, like, fucking ShahZaM's, like, the most genius player ever? And then, like, and then back then it would be some shit like, I don't know, fucking, and like, Hiko, like, the joke is it was all the people who were sort of semi-washed in CS. Because here's the thing that's really bizarre if you don't come from CSGO, is, like, here's who ShahZaM was in CSGO. I wouldn't go as far. It's like some people are going too far the other way. He wasn't a moron, but he was someone where basically you would never imagine him being the leader. He was not only an AWPer, but he was a very streaky AWPer. He was the kind of AWPer who just like constantly repeats the angle every single time, and he either kills everyone or just gets killed, like, might just get instantly traded himself and do nothing. And in the game, again, it's not, I don't think he was like a moron. I think that's people in CSGO who don't know Valorant trying to go, how could he be considered a genius in this game? And they're trying to make the contrast too extreme. But like I say, he's not someone you would put as your in-game leader, and more importantly, I would say most people would never have said they thought of him as a cerebral player, put it that way. He was kind of sort of as just like a guy who just goes out there and frags, like, plays off his aim, and it's a bit erratic, and then finally, the last detail, this is why it's crazy to me, he's a leader as well, right? Not that long ago, it was last year, there was that really bizarre drama where Zombs from Sentinels just came out and was, for no reason on stream, was just like, yeah, I heard that actually, like, Richard Lewis was paid by Jack Etienne to write that article about 100 Thieves in CSGO with the match fixing, even though, by the way, Zombs wasn't there, knew fuck all about it, with some little noob from Overwatch. And the stupid thing he did was he even dropped ShahZaM in it. He just said, like basically, I was just told it by ShahZaM. And the joke of that is, like, the second all of us in CSGO heard, like, ShahZaM's the one who told him, we were all like, well, no wonder, because if you don't know, ShahZaM's like one of the all-time shit stirrers / trolls in the NA scene. Like, he is the guy who'd, like, jokingly say, like, and that guy matrixed the game, and you don't even know, does he mean it for real? Is he actually call him out? Is he just fucking with him? So I find it so wild that he's actually, like, a leader of men, like the fucking the one making all the plans. And dusT, give me some insight here. What's he like in Valorant? Is he a different guy? Is the skill set of the game different? What's going on? I feel like I've come through like the fucking looking glass here, mate. And then ShahZaM's just waiting for me with like a genius hat. I'm like, oh, welcome. I have 400 IQ and I am actually the master of this game. Like, come on, hit me with it, dusT.
I mean, I will say Valorant, ShahZaM, is a little more wise than CS ShahZaM. Like, I will say he's matured in a lot of ways.
He's obviously older, yeah, of course. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, as you age, obviously, you just kind of mature naturally anyway. Certainly, there's still some moments on his stream and stuff like that where you're like, okay, man, like, he's back.
Okay.
But I mean, it's one of those things where I feel like he has matured. And I think really kind of what happened with him being an IGL on Sentinels is, well, first of all, you have to understand that this might be the longest standing roster in North America, if I'm not mistaken. Like, their last roster change was like February of last year, and they picked up TenZ. And I think they officially
it was when the
them.
whole Sinatra thing happened, right?
Yeah, I think they
it was
officially...
kind of out of necessity.
Yeah, exactly. So the point is that they're the longest standing roster. So they haven't really made any adjustments as far as like swapping in-game leader or swapping players and like that. Not for the most part. Their only change was, like you said, out of necessity. And so I think early on in Valorant, like when teams start getting formed basically in like mid to late 2020 with Beta, with some of the first early tournaments being run by organizations, you didn't know who was a good IGL in Valorant. It was a brand new game. You didn't know what to get. And obviously some teams leaned heavily on former IGLs, particularly formerly from Counter-Strike. So you think of someone like Finesse, for example, on Indie that eventually became to Optic. Exactly, Steel coming over. When Nitro briefly had his little parade inside Valorant, he was the poised to be the IGL of 100 Thieves with the Steel departure. And so you had a lot of that going on, right? Just kind of reliant upon CS veterans. Even like, I guess TSM was kind of reliant on like pseudo in-game leaders from CS, like Hazed and Cutler, who had kind of dabbled in that role at different points in their career. So I think a lot of that was happening. But at the end of the day, you didn't know like, okay, who's just like a natural IGL for Valorant. We've seen some of those start to emerge, like Valen, like Xander, things of that nature, but you didn't really know about that back then. And so when teams were kind of forming, I think Sentinels were more reliant upon just bringing together like a mixture of veteran and very skilled players and just trying to build the team off of the back of that. And I think ShahZaM, I don't know if he did it out of necessity or if he really truly was trying to make like a mentality pivot on like who he wanted to be on a team, like as a leader or as more of just like a star player. I mean, certainly initially that is kind of what he was meant to be. You know, he was the Jet. He was the one that was kind of like...
Everyone was also saying he was the best player as well as the IGL when he was first popping off, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly doing some big things. And then he obviously made that pivot for TenZ. Like when TenZ comes into the fold, they need a new player. The whole Sinatra incident happens. He's the one that took the pivot to Sova. Now, granted, he had already played Sova on a couple of maps just strategically because they would sometimes flex Sinatra into like duelists, and so he would pick up a Sova. I think Bind, kind of comes to mind as a map that would happen in the past. So he had already kind of dabbled in that, and so it naturally made sense for him to make that pivot role-wise within the game as far as agents. But yeah, I just kind of wonder like what... I don't know if he just kind of maintained IGL because there just never was another opportunity to bring another one in, or if they just, maybe they tried and didn't come up with anything. Maybe they were just reliant on eventually bringing a coach in. I don't know. Sentinels is just such a weird team, man, because, they've always had this reputation of like not practicing a lot or scrimming a lot or something like that. And I do think a lot of that is a little bit BS, like a little bit of people just like using hyperbole and kind of stretching things out.
Just to make them sound cool.
Yeah, but there definitely have had some roadblocks that are legitimate. Like, for example, they were late to the fold this year because of TenZ having travel and visa issues and stuff like that. So they were late to practicing, I guess you should say, for this stage because of the whole move of TenZ from Canada to the US and things of that nature. So, yeah, I don't know, to answer your question. Like, I think maybe they were early on able to get away with like looser, scrappier calling and just use their skill and kind of experience and maybe just like in-game chemistry and mid-rounding to be able to get them through and be the best. When they were certainly reigning supreme there for a while. But now that teams are starting to, I don't want to say master the game, but they're certainly figuring out like better combinations of utility and how to set people up and how to do certain things. You're starting to see other teams emerge, and Sentinels have kind of fallen behind. They no longer hold the throne in North America. If anything, man, you could almost argue they're not even top 5 right now. You could make that argument. Yeah. You could put 5 teams ahead of them right now in your ranking. Yeah, so I think they're on the fringe. I think you probably could put them at like 4 through 6 or something like that. But there are definitely some teams that have leapfrogged them and they've just kind of fallen behind. And I don't know what the answer is. They're certainly looking for a new coach. So that could be the solution. Someone to bring in some more ideas, some more creativity. Maybe pivoting in-game leader, letting ShahZaM just be a player in the future could be something that they have to consider. It's just hard to know, really.
I think also like it has to be considered as well that ShahZaM, because they haven't had a coach for a lot of their existence, like ShahZaM was kind of being that as well. Like he was the guy who was coming up with all like outside of the server, like coming up with all of their like strats or whatever. And I use that term loosely, but like,
of course, yes.
And everything that they want to be doing. So it kind of made sense as well for like him to be the IGL because he's the one who's going to be like implementing the ideas that he has come up with. I think I mean, the thing that also ShahZaM always got lauded for is the fact that like his in-game, obviously, his mid-round decision making specifically was always quite like intuitive and would work very well. But again, we're still talking about the era of like the first half of 2021, like around their Masters 2 run, that kind of time. Like, I still think that ShahZaM is good. He's clearly a good caller at like the way they've always played. My biggest criticism for Sentinels is that they need to change the way they play, and they need some external structure to be brought in by a coach to basically say, right, here's some like, we're going to do some dry runs of this shit. Like we're going to have this setup, this set play, this set play. And that's something that Sentinels have never really played around that much. So while ShahZaM is like clearly very good at you know, the thing that Sentinels have always stuck by playing, or like how they want to play, that hasn't necessarily always been the quote unquote correct way to play.
Yeah.
By the way, dusT, along those lines. Yeah, go on, make your point.
Yeah, no, I remember there was this like famous clip that came out. It was like all over the Reddit and stuff like that. It was like from ShahZaM stream or something like that. It was like right when Sentinels started struggling, and basically people were kind of like commenting about, you know, how they had fallen behind, how they looked like they lacked structure, they lacked like strategy and things of that nature. And basically ShahZaM was like exclaiming, like, where are all these 6 strats that you're talking about? Because everyone's doing basically the same thing. Like, no one has any super 6 strats. Like, show me the super 6 strats and how we're behind. And at the time that he said that, he was kind of right. Like, there really wasn't like a whole lot of complexity. I mean, there was certain like alt combos that teams would do, and there was just like certain like things that just made sense to combo together, like a smoke with the flash, or a drone with a duelist falling behind it and like a flash coming through or something like that. Like little basic thing, utility changes like that were certainly part of the game. Well, the strats are here now. That's the thing. Like, you have seen teams be able to figure out these really cool ways to make things happen. You know, I think of version 1, who was incredibly good at their utility use, particularly Zelsis, has like really shown how to use KO properly to support your teammates. Certainly the Guard is really known for their utility. Same thing could be said, like even Optics kind of drifting more towards that direction, from a free-flowing team to having a little bit more structure to how they attack and how they set up their counters and stuff like that. So I think that is now what we're going to have to see, like this new wave of teams actually finding more complex strategy. How does Sentinels adapt? Because they are, again, a team that hasn't made any changes. You know, they don't have a coach yet. I mean, certainly, supposedly they do have one. It's supposed to get announced really soon. Maybe it gets announced as this episode comes out or something like that. So never really know the timing on that one. But yeah, I think that's going to be big for them. Is like, coaching's going to come first, see how that affects the team, see how they're able to work with them. And then from there, you have to make a call on like what makes sense.
Because there's quite a good abstract topic we could get into here, and I'd actually be very interested to know, because obviously Geo comes from games I didn't follow except Overwatch, so I'd be interested to know actually what like the status of how people were in-game leaders in those games are, because basically I'm getting the vibe from Sentinels of, dusT is going to know this, like the 2019 Team Liquid squad, where if people don't know, they had probably the most skilled lineup maybe ever in Counter-Strike, by the way. Like 1 through 5 were like probably more skilled than whoever was in the other role, because essentially even the in-game leader, which is the point I'm going to make, which was Nitro. If people don't know, years before that, once upon a time, Nitro was Team Liquid's star player. And then basically, as the years went on and the people who were like the true in-game leaders left the team and they kept having to like take turns to give it a go, basically, he initially did the thing that I hate, which is what we're going to get into, where you're like a star player and so temporarily you go, well, I'll give it a go, I'll be the leader or whatever. But realistically, you're just thinking, if it goes perfect, I'll be the leader. And then what happens is 2 months in, when you hit like a bad game, when none of your calls work, or you're just like sick of, you know, you're not having good games yourself because you're having to put all the extra brain power to be basically anyone who does it temporarily almost inevitably always does quit at some point in time. And then the problem then is you're right back at square one. You're like, right, we have to get a leader again. And so all you really do when you do that is you think you're helping your team out, but you're just sort of like delaying the inevitable, which is at some point you're going to have to get a real in-game leader. But what's interesting about this example is that was when he first became the in-game leader. A couple of years later, basically, he actually fully had embraced the role. He'd been through some coaches, to be fair, who actually helped him develop like the way he thought about the game. And by the time they came to this 2019 lineup, which was one of the all-time great teams, he essentially was able to be like a full-time leader. But even then, it was of more of a loose style team. It was based around, like, obviously he knew his teammates, he knew how skilled they were, so he knew how to set them up and let them go. But the problem is, that's a team where, and this is why I want to draw the parallel, there's 2 angles here I'm getting at. One is, I'm personally, in the games I've followed in Counter-Strike especially, I'm not a fan of people who only temporarily are sort sort of like, I'll do it for the time being. Because as I say, to me, you're just delaying the... First of all, it very rarely is a happenstance move will work and actually make you better than you were before. You're never usually going to be the number one team doing it. And then secondly, I personally find you're eventually just going to have to bite the bullet. And either this guy says, right, in that case, I'm an IGL forever now, in which is, okay, it's going to be my career and I'm going to devote all my time to it. Or shit, or get off the pot. It's time to get another person in. They'll be the IGL. So in this, the second detail to say was, the reason I bring the Team Liquid example up is because I think their whole problem was they essentially had the perfect in-game leader when all the players were at the peak of their powers, because he just had a very loose style, but he knew his team. And you got like, it was like a great way to min-max the role. You got the minimum you needed out of an IGL, but he still gave you some fragging, and the team as a result was OP. But the problem was, the moment players dropped off, that team structure just collapses immediately. You have nothing then, because you don't have the structure, you don't have little trick play. Essentially, you're just relying on people that you've sort of given agency, you've given them power to do what they want to do as stars, and if they can't be the best players in the game, you just drop the rankings, you just drop down. And the worst part about that team setup, I'll say as a final detail, is because you've essentially made the team, like, we're all just mega skilled, you can never cut people in those teams. There's never the obvious guy that everyone scapegoats where it's like, right, well, you know, as soon as the results get bad, we'll kick this guy. Like, if you're all people who've been star players, you all just look around going, well, I mean, he's pretty good, and it means that you just wait like 3 months extra than you need to, and that can cost you, you know, like a key qualification, a run of form, etc. So I want to get your thoughts, both of you, on this angle here. Like, what do you think of this? Because this feels like, with the example here, like, is ShahZaM really going to be, you know, in 2 years, will he be an in-game leader, and will he have like adapted to this, and maybe he becomes amazing at it, he puts all his effort in, or will it just be that they get a coach in, the coach tells him in a few months, let's just, as dusT said, let's just bring you back to a different role, let's bring in a guy to be the in-game leader, maybe that's what fixes Sentinels. Who wants to comment on this?
Yeah, I'll go first, because I think this does kind of lean into a way that I've spoken about Sentinels publicly before, which is that I don't think any of these players as individuals are washed in terms of their skill, and I think that makes it very hard to want to change the roster or anything like that, because I think maybe if you were to try and highlight a weak spot right now, I would probably place it at Dapper, which is a shame, because when I first really started seriously watching like competitive Valorant, I thought that Dapper was kind of the pinnacle of how to play a lot of Sentinels. And then when Nats came in from Gambit and really changed the way that you play that role, it started to change. But I think that's like the really tough thing about Sentinels right now, is it's like, okay, do we accept that like this is a lot of really skilled individual players, but they don't necessarily work as a unit? And I think we see this in a number of esports, and it is definitely something we saw in Rainbow Six. I remember very clearly in 2020 there were 4 specific orgs that all tried to do the whole, we're building a super team. Right. And on paper, the players involved in those teams were really great players. It was like, yeah, of course these are going to be super teams, and they just don't work. Like as soon as an org says we're building a super team, your org is like, your team is doomed. It never happens. It never works that way, because you can't always rely on the fact that like you have all of these individuals and that it's gonna make something really great. And I do think, to like link that to what you were saying about, do IGLs have to commit for the long term? The answer to that really is yes, because they have to be the adhesive that is or like the WD-40 that like is running between all of the different components of the team and making it flow. Like, you can have like 5 really great components, but if they don't flow together well, then it's not going to work that great. And I think that because the IGLing is the literal direction of how the team is to play, that has to be something that is A, consistent, and B, like grown and constantly worked on to grow synergy and understanding. And as time goes on, and I wish I could remember who it was I saw discussing this, there was some Rainbow Six Pro, I remember there was maybe a podcast or something about it, but one of the things that was being discussed was like, as time goes on, isn't IGL going to end up saying less because they don't need to say as much, because they understand the team more, so the actual calls that get said become more valuable, but more like sparse and very like specific, and it's less like constant, real solid direction or whatever, because eventually it is not needed as much. And like, is that how that you judge like solid IGLing? I personally, my assumption would be that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that you're an amazing IGL, but it is an indication that it is a very well coordinated and synergized team, which I think is one of the single most important things for success as a team.
Yeah, I think that like this team almost demands that you have a lot of cerebral players on your team because the variability of, you know, utility and how it's used and the different choke points all across the map is like an opportunity can come up at any given moment that someone has to be able to identify and call. And that's why you see teams that have like a lot of good chemistry and team play, like a version 1, like a Cloud9 in North America, capitalize on those situations a lot because their team is all on the same page. They're really well coordinated, and you know, they have a lot of guys who can communicate really well, and they can get things done in the heat of the moment where you got to make snap-second decisions. So I think that is definitely a part of it. But going back to the whole like ShahZaM being an IGL long term and Sentinels and all that good stuff, I could see it going either way. I mean, certainly ShahZaM adopted the role right off the rip. It's not as if he like was forced into it. Yeah, granted, true. I do think that they were probably in a situation when they made this team where maybe they didn't really know of any other like IGL that they could get. I mean, there was certainly some other CS IGLs that had transferred over, but a lot of them had already gone to other teams, or they had already made their team so early on and they were doing well that there was really no reason to adapt or change or anything like that. And if we're honest, I do think that, you know, Sentinels have had struggles for a while, but to be honest, even their lows weren't that bad last year. Like they were still qualifying for the international events. It's just they weren't getting as deep as they were. I mean,
it was totally a relative thing.
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
like the crazy thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously won the second Masters event, and so they were like at that point considered the best team in the world. But then the next couple events, like Champions, for example, that they didn't even make it out of the group stage, and so there wasn't decline internationally, but they were still reigning supreme in North America. Like they were still top of the food chain when it came to regional play. This is the first time, really, in a year basically, that we haven't seen them at the top of the food chain. And so this 3 month or so period that we're in right now is we've really identified, okay, these other teams have caught up. They also have very skilled players. They're now surpassing you when it comes to shot calling and being able to identify new strategy and new ways to play the game and just, you know, optimize the basics that we already know work. And you're the one that's starting to fall behind. And to me, there's a lot of moving parts that make you wonder, like, has their practice been good enough? Has their preparation been good enough? There's been a lot of, like, again, rumoring and joking around that they don't practice at all. And I know that's not true. But again, we know that they had the issue with, like, Tens not being here originally and having to move him. And so they delayed their practice because of that. So that makes you wonder they don't have the coaching staff. That makes you wonder. There's so many variables in play with Sentinels on, like, why they may not be performing well, that it's hard to identify like what the true cause is. Is it because Dapper's fallen off in form a little bit? Is it because, you know, his IGLing hasn't been up to snuff? He's kind of fallen behind in the meta and fallen behind it, and tactically while other teams have really started to skyrocket in those departments? Is it because they lack a coach and analyst or something like that? It's really hard to identify like what is actually the problem with this team. I just know that when you watch them play, they do not look as refined as all these other teams. Like some of these teams are super sharp, man, when you watch them play right now, as far as like their timings, how they combo together, like their spacing, just all those things. Whereas sometimes it feels like Sentinels are still very reliant upon, you know, letting Tens be Tens, like letting him make individual plays or letting someone else really pop off.
That's not working well right now.
Yeah,
like, Tens isn't performing well.
Yeah, they're spread really thin right now is the problem. Like when you watch them play, it is very much based on individual playmaking a lot of time. And those people aren't making plays anymore. And I'm not saying that Tens is like Wash or something. He had like one bad series, something like that against version 1. But he's not getting as much impact because other players are starting to emerge that you could argue are better. Like Ye, incredible. We have so many good Jets in North America. It's like pretty unreal.
Leaf.
Yeah, Leaf is absolutely incredible. 100%. People I feel like people always like sleep on him on the list. Not anymore. I feel like now it's like, all right, yeah, this guy probably is the best actually right now in the scene. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is, to be honest with you. Like I'd be curious to see what happens once they add a coach and see if that can change the dynamic of the team a little bit, give them a little bit more. And then I think you have to go from there at that point. But I could really go either way. I think there is still a chance for ShahZaM to adapt and like figure things out with the help of a coach or something like that. But there's also a situation where like maybe you do think, okay, like maybe we need something else leadership wise that we're not getting right now. But I just don't know like how you would make room for that person, you know, because, you know, ShahZaM seems adaptable. He already did give up a lot to, you know, secure Tens and make sure that Tens could get what he wanted. But yeah, I just don't know the answer to that one, unfortunately. I don't think there is an easy answer.
Another thing I'm concerned about, I have to say as well, is anytime you have a big name team, this is something we used to have also in CSGO, which is some of the teams that were successful either without coaches or like, you know, the coach is like a mate of one of the players and he's in the team briefly, right? Those teams also sometimes use the fact that because they can succeed without the coach, that's like a way to buy yourself 3 months extra if you ever underperform as a team, because you go to the org and you go, oh, we obviously need a coach now, so let's start the search search. And by the way, while you're starting the search, no one gets kicked from the team, do you? It sort of gives you a bit of like breathing room. Then you get the coach, so that gives you another month because it's like, well, we're bedding in the new coach, we're figuring out. And like the joke is, like the team might just have kept playing the same exact in the game style, but you just get a few extra months where superstar teams, especially as I say, the problem with superstar teams is, like I said, it's like they all look to one side and go, well, we're all supposed to be the predators, so obviously we're not kicking any of us out, right? You're staying in the team, you're staying in also I might be bad next month, so I don't want you kicking me out. And in the short term, by the way, it's not even a bad strategy. Like as you say, dusT, I'm sure at the beginning of the game, if anything, people were probably just taking people who had like a rep for being a tactical genius from CSGO and claiming they were doing that in Valorant. Whereas I have to say, in the early games I watched, where I tried watching some of the famous people from CS, like, I couldn't see any strats. I was like, what is this? It's like people just making great solo players. I get that, but like, what amazing tack are they talking about? Like, wasn't that just a coincidence this guy came on this timing? So in the short term, by the way, a great tactic in every game is obviously stack skill at the beginning of the game before people get like this meta down and the protocols of how you do the tactics and stuff. And so in every game, like even in Overwatch before Owl, there was a lot of really great Western teams that would just banger players, like the great Widowmaker with the great fucking Pharah with the
sick,
perfect example.
Yeah.
And they're a great example of where when you could just play off skill, they were fucking amazing. When you had to adapt to a new meta, their team just fell apart piece by piece by piece. It's even, by the way, not even a bad analogy, Gio. There's another team that slowly changed coaches, changed stars, and it's like they just did a ship of Theseus until at the end it was just a totally different team, and you were like, what were we even going for here? Like, now we just wasted a year almost. So that's why I always worry about those teams, because as you said, relative to all the other teams, they've never really been bad. They've never been like a slump where they're like, wow, cut the whole team. But if anything, I go the other way on that. When you have players like they do, you're supposed to be at the top. You're supposed to be winning. You can't be like, but I was fifth. That's cool. It's like, that ain't cool when you got the lineup they have. You're supposed to be number one, right?
Not when you have two slots. This format is cutthroat right now.
Sentinels aren't making it to Masters.
No, probably
it's not happening. No, absolutely not.
Doubt it,
like, there's no way.
You think this is it current form? Is it the meta SWAT? What do you think this is going to kill the chances? Are the other teams just better right now?
Yeah, I mean, wait, where's the freaking bracket?
So the bracket, if people don't know, the format, they play against the Guard, who obviously is the team we're going to talk about, so we can get into that in a second. Version 1 plays Luminosity. It's the same side of the bracket. This is the upper bracket, remember? And then the other side is Optic XSET and Cloud9 Knights. So you've been hyping the Guard. Did the Guard just beat them outright in this first match?
So again, obviously, like, we have questions about how the Guard are going to adapt to this meta, but I would say, just given how things have been over the course of stage 1, my prediction would be that the Guard would win that game. But even if they didn't, Sentinels would get absolutely destroyed by V1. Because there's no way LG are beating V1, so we don't even need to discuss that. But, like, Sentinels would get, like, kicked out of the server by V1. I'm pretty sure V1 are making it to Grand Finals. And then what would even the lower bracket be? If they lost to the Guard, they'd be playing Luminosity. Okay, yeah, they could win that.
Depends if they do a bracket flip. I think maybe the next round's the bracket flip, isn't it?
Right,
Isn't it usually the first round? Like, I think they'd have to play Luminosity in, like, the lower round 2, if you know what I mean. I think in round 1 they'd play, like, Knights or etc. Whoever. I usually flip the first round, I think, right?
Either way, I mean, I think that XSET could definitely give, like, Sentinels a run for their money if they were, like, playing against them. And those are, like, going back to what you dust said a little bit earlier, where you're like, Sentinels could be 5th. I think XSET are probably the other team where you're like, they could be in 5th place.
Right, they're the
it's very
team.
close between those two. So that could go one way or the other, I suppose. With Knights, I think Sentinels would probably beat Knights. I think Knights have shown a lot of improvement over the course of this stage, but I don't think, like, enough to necessarily warrant them getting super far in this bracket. So I just think when it gets to the point where it's like, if Sentinels, let's say that they get through those first couple rounds, like, fine. As soon as they have to come up against a team like Optic, like V1, like Cloud9, like, they're boned. They're absolutely fucking boned. Like, those teams are just way above them. I think it's going to be Cloud9 version 1 who are making it to Grand Finals. And I don't really see many ways that could go wrong. So yeah, I don't think Sentinels are going to be playing on LAN.
Okay, well, in that case, an obvious pivot here is the other big name right now, because obviously we've done the whole 100 Thieves thing on the last episode, like, they're still not figuring out their fucking lineup. The other big team, though, that you didn't mention there in the spot set, Gio, was you didn't mention former Envy, now Optic Gaming. Optic. So let's talk about this. dusT, give me your thoughts on Optic, because again, I'll give people a bit of insight. I'll do a little bit of what I did in those videos where I did, like, who is this player from CSGO? So I'll give, like, my perspective, and then dusT can, like, integrate it into Valorant here. Basically, the player he referenced earlier, Yay, is another another player we all know from CSGO, but he was sort of the guy who never got past tier 2, as it were. Like, he was in some NA teams that even went to majors, but like they would never be that relevant in the major, or they'd have like, you know, it'd be like a massive fluke if they got an upset. But the thing was, he was clearly a skilled player. You could actually see this when you watched him in Counter-Strike, but he just seemed like someone to me where it's a bit like, to be fair, when he got to the top, he wasn't, it was only a couple of years he was really competing. So to me, he always lacked for, like, he didn't look like in the game he always had like the best decision making or the experience of a top player, because obviously in Counter-Strike, you might be playing against a guy who played for 7 years at the tier 1 when you're in year 1, you know, so it's a bit of a mismatch in terms of raw experience of the game. So I've heard so many good things every time I've ever looked in the Valorant subreddit about this guy. It seems like he pops off like a motherfucker in Valorant. So who is he in Valorant, dusT?
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy that emerged on Anbox, a team that never really accomplished too much as a team, but Ye was always a very bright individual player on that team, and they kind of got picked apart slowly over time. I think was their biggest problem. Like
a meme of Anbox.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Android obviously left to go to NRG, then Poach, they dropped, who was their in-game leader, and just slowly but surely that team kind of just got piranha'd, basically. But yeah, Ye emerged as a star of that team, as particularly a Jet player, and very powerful on the Jet. But he also early on showed that he could flex to other roles. Like, I think he played some Sage, he played some other agents here and there when the team needed to, and he was still very effective in those roles as well. And so, yeah, that was the big thing, was like, the big move of last year, maybe the biggest and most successful move in North America, was Ye to Envy, what of course now Optic, just because it brought them some additional firepower. You know, when they dropped Mummy, they bring Ye in, and Ye was more of a true star player to go alongside Victor, used to go by Food and CSGO, and kind of like give them a little bit more, right? Because they certainly had great roles, like Finesse, solid in-game leader, Crash, he's one of the best Sovas in North America. You know, it just added that additional star power to the team. And yeah, Ye is definitely a carry level player. You know, he's definitely one of those guys that can make big plays, and he's done it on the international stage as well. He was the guy rivaling Tens, I guess you could say, through a lot of last year, and who was like the best Jet from North America, as we were still waiting for other Jets to kind of emerge, like we're starting to see now throughout the course of this year. So yeah, I mean, Ye is very much a star player, and Optic, I think, is still very much a top 5 team in North America, hands down. There's no question about that. It's just, are they a top 2 team to make it to the international events? And that's really the tough one, because certainly Cloud9's the favorite to be number 1 in North America. They've done everything that they needed to do to prove that they are the best in North America. Even if they don't think that they are, I think that they are. I think if you had to do like a power ranking right now, you certainly would put them at the top. But I think Optic is right there on that bubble of that second spot, where it could be them, right, but it could also be version 1. It could also maybe be like XSET making like a crazy run, because they definitely had the talent to do it. There's a couple other teams out there that they have to kind of worry about that would then maybe deny them that spot. But certainly I like Optic a lot. I think that they have a very good like roster. Again, I think Crashies is fantastic in his role. I think Finesse does a pretty good job IGLing and flexing roles as he needs to. I think my biggest issue with them is Victor at times has had some struggles here and there. Certainly at the end of last year, he was kind of forgiven because I think he was like really ill when they were playing on LAN or something like that.
COVID,
and so
right?
it's like, yeah, he had to like be isolated, I think, like quarantined to like a hotel room or something like that to play. So I kind of just was like hands off about that performance. It's like, man, like it's hard for me to really knock on you for that one.
Yeah, sure.
But this year he still had some hiccups here and there. I just think that maybe his agent diversity isn't as deep as some other flex players, as far as like how his effectiveness drops off between when he plays Agent X versus Agent Y, you know, is something that's still kind of being worked on with him. But I think that they are still very much in the mix. Like, I would not be shocked at all to see Optic come out second or something instead of version 1 for this bracket run. Like, I
by
think
the way,
still very good.
Gio, am I wrong in thinking? I'm sure you said something like when they were Envy, they were your favorite team, right?
Yeah, so I actually, it's funny hearing dusT say like, oh, I think that Victor's had these hiccups here and there, because in the Sky meta, Victor was easily my favorite player just to watch.
Right.
Like, I thought that he was a fantastic Sky. I actually am pretty happy with the way that he plays KO. Like, I think that he does a good job of supporting the team, and I find myself getting quite opinionated about like players of this role, because it's the role I find the most interesting,
right,
which is maybe like a little bit of bias, but I'm a big fan of Victor. But I think the really big thing about Ye, just going back to that original topic of conversation, is the really big thing with Ye right now. Yeah, he's an incredible opper. He's amazing with the operator, and that has made him a phenomenal chamber. Like, because his ability of using like chamber's utility, the way he uses his teleports combined with opping, has just been fantastic. I think that he has really shown how to like control a lot of space single-handedly, which is obviously in a game where you have so much utility, and there is kind of that mini game of like utility economy. I'm not talking about round by round economy. I'm talking about, can you force utility out of your opponent, and how much utility do you have to use to achieve a certain goal? Having a chamber who can control so much space just by standing there with a sniper, I think is an incredibly valuable asset to have to use. So not only is he great at engaging, but also on that defensive side, I think he's been really fantastic as a chamber, which has been just hugely valuable to them. Again, obviously FNS, I am a big fan of. I think that his calling seems to be pretty good. I'm enjoy watching him play the Sentinel roles. And also, if we're just looking at these, the games of this recent weekend, which is obviously the first time that we've seen patch 4.04 be played, Marved on Brimstone was a joy to watch, because again, we're looking at a lot of these controller players, how are they coming through into this new meta? Now, a lot of teams have been opting to play Omen as their preferred controller. We haven't seen quite as much Brim be played, who is the other controller that got a big buff. Marv is actually you were talking about some of the roster swaps that happened last year. Marv is the newest player on this roster. He came in just before Masters 3. He's technically still on loan from FaZe Clan, I think, but I don't see him ever going back. And I actually remember there being some criticism about him prior to that, where people would say there was some rumor or some reputation of him not being a great teammate, but he had friends on the Envy roster. And so people were like, oh, maybe, they'll get on better in the server because they're already friends. And actually, I think Marv has been an excellent addition to this team. And his, what he provides as a controller has been great. But seeing him play this Brim, and especially the way he's used his orbital strikes to be able to get the better of Knights in a number of positions on Bind, which is a map where you would expect to see a Brim be played, I thought was a really good and promising outcome for going into playoffs where we're going to be playing on this patch. My concern with Optic is that we have seen more open floors from them than we have from Cloud9. Cloud9 obviously being sort of on the other side of the group, or in the other group, sorry, kind of being the team that we look at as that, pinnacle, and who are we comparing everybody to? I think in the Optic V1 game is where we really saw some of those flaws come out from Optic, because V1 sort of thrashed them. Now, one thing we saw that was excellent from Optic was some real creativity. They brought the neon on Haven, which was incredibly exciting for everyone, and you could tell that they'd really planned some of these set plays. Version 1 just ended up being better at adapting against that, and I really think Zellsis did a great job of, in the middle of that game, actually helping to change the way that they were playing to sort of nullify a lot of the value that the neon brought. But then when you look over to a map like Icebox, for me, that was the perfect example of when it goes bad for Optic. And the real thing that I noticed in that map was when it was going bad for Optic, it always came down to, we need Ye to clutch this round as our win condition. And I think if the worst showing of your team has such a clear, obvious, singular win condition that can be exploited by other teams that are potentially better than you, it's a very, very dangerous thing for other teams to know.
Yeah, that neon game was hilarious, by the way, because at first it was working out because he was just sprinting past. Yeah, Victor's just sprinting past all the utility with neon, just completely breaking the A lobby control meta that we're used to on that map. But then the moment that he started getting countered, they didn't have that next level of he would just kind of run into a brick wall a couple of times with neon through utility, just get stunned and be dead, and then that was just giving advantages over. So yeah, the creativity was there, but I feel like they weren't ready for the next step, when their initial game plan didn't work, and so that was a little bit tough with neon. But yeah, generally I agree with most of all what you're saying. I think that they're just a team to me that's proven, right? See, a team like the Guard, I don't know if they're a flash in the pan or if they're going to persist. Whereas a team like Optic and formerly Envy, of course, they've been doing it for a while. Same with XSET, same with Cloud9 ever since Vanity joined the team. These teams have been a little bit more proven. They have that track record. They have that resume that you can really lay on. So I still think Optic's definitely a threat just because of how strong their players are. How good they have been in the past with their shot calling. They're very explosive. They can be super deadly in the fast-paced type rounds. In particular, Finesse has always kind of thrived playing that style of game, and they're very good at it. And I think one of the cool things we have seen this year is we have seen them add a little bit more complexity to some of their tactics. It hasn't been as scrappy as it had been in the past. They just kind of play that up-tempo style. They can kind of bog it down down and use their utility a little bit more in a refined way. And they've obviously had a lot of time together now with this team to kind of refine things and kind of get the team play on point. So again, I think Optic is still a very strong candidate to make it through this bracket. I just think it's one of those situations where I think Optic's just the victim of their shinier objects out there to keep an eye on right now. Like V1 has been so impressive. The guard has been super impressive. Cloud9 continues to look like the dominant team in the region. So it's just there's been other, I don't know if you call it like more fascinating, but there's just like more prevalent storylines right now in the scene that are being focused on. And so people kind of just like sleep on Optic a little bit almost because it's like, oh yeah, they're still like a top 5 team. Yeah, they've been like that for a while. But look at this team over here popping off, right? So I do wonder if there's just like a little bit of a victim to just like attention being focused on teams that just the eye test.
Recency bias.
Yeah, it's a bit of recency bias, but just generally speaking from the eye test, teams like Cloud9 and the guard have looked more impressive. Yeah.
Right, okay. By the way, Gio, look, it might be a whole separate video, but give me a taste of what you would do. What's the nuance to how like a player like Victor plays that people aren't seeing? Just give me a taste of the rant.
So the thing that I really enjoy about the way that Victor plays is, for me, he is the quintessential example of like the very supportive initiator. And the counter example I always give, and I say this every time, is Ethan on 100 Thieves.
Right.
If we're looking back at the Sky meta, Ethan was very good at like playing for himself. He almost would play Sky like a duelist. So he would flash for himself and he would play off his utility. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. It was actually something that Ethan was very good at. But for me, Victor and actually I think Zeppa on Cloud9 is also in this camp, are very, very good at specifically setting up the other people on their team, you know, notably their duelists or whatever, by using their utility to initiate for them. And then obviously, you know, that because they're flex players, they can also hold their own in a mechanical sense, but that's not necessarily their priority when they're using that kind of utility. And I think that as KO has really made it into the meta this stage because, you know, Cloud9 kind of popularized the way to play KO these days. I think we're seeing, for me at least, in terms of how I'm sort of rating my KOs or whether I like the way a team is playing KO, it is how much do they fit into that camp? Like, how well do they divvy out their utility? How well spread is it throughout throughout the use in a round, and how much are their teammates getting value off the back of it? So, for example, a KO or a KO player in NA that I've had some criticism for has been Marder, because I think that Marder tries too much, and this is on Luminosity, I think Marder tries too much to play individualistically, and I personally don't like that way of trying to play KO, because I think you get the most out of his utility by doing it in the way that I see people like Victor and Zeppa playing.
Yeah, Zelsis, I think, would also be in that camp for me.
Yeah,
just like his pop flash is so powerful to set up other teammates, as well as like obviously, you know, using the knife to kind of get a little bit of info, just to give your entry like a bit more to work with whenever they're going in, and just kind of being there to trade frag as well. I think KO kind of requires like the perfect mixture of aggression and support, because you want to be there to trade frag, because typically you are going to be buddied with your duelist to take map control, but you need to get that utility off initially first to kind of set up that entry before you start to follow up with the trades. And so, like you said, some people are maybe a little bit jumping the gun and trying to be like the entry as KO and not being as supportive as they need to be. They have that aggression that you want, but they don't have like that supportive element that people want. But you're seeing a lot of that from you know, Zeppa and Zelsis in particular. And like you said, Victor definitely can do that as well. And the cooler thing about Cloud9 is that they can kind of rotate that responsibility between Zeppa and Leaf depending on the map, depending on whether they want the Raze or they want the Jet in the duelist slot. So that's another thing that's really allowed Cloud9 to persist in the region.
Let's talk a bit about Cloud9 and just pivot to that then, because an interesting thing to me coming from CSGO is this is a team where I know every single player in this lineup, because they're all from the NA scene minus Zeta. And if people don't know, what used to happen was in CSGO, the Korean teams were never very good, unfortunately, because they had a very, very limited scene and they also just didn't get to compete in the West very often. But of their players, this guy was the best player. He was clearly the best Korean player. And as a result, he even actually at the end of his CSGO career got a gig in China playing in Tai Lu. And spoiler, I'm going to go ahead and guess they weren't speaking English, because I know the Chinese players didn't speak English. So he even went and played in a team where effectively, as far as I know, I don't even know if he could communicate with them. So that's how you know this guy has skills and like he was respected, you know. So interestingly already to me that he's been important, because if you don't know, in League of Legends, Cloud9 is famously an org that is willing to like go for the big imports and try like doing something like Korean imports. If you don't know, one of the approaches they take is not the original approach people used to take in League of Legends 10 years ago, which is you just sign the player. They know now you've got to have, like, you know, like the right people to make him comfortable. You got to have like a chef that cooks him his Korean food. You've got to kind of like set an environment up so they feel comfy. So I'm already interested in the fact he's there. And then else, aside from that, it's clear to me that this is a team that was trying to stack skill the whole time. Like, you look at the other players they have. Xeppaa was someone in CSGO who, despite the fact his end of his career, unfortunately, was in the doomed Cloud9 project, he was actually doing all right in that team, if people don't know it. The problem was this. He was just, that was too early for him. I always thought he was like a year away from being really good, basically. He needed more time to play tier 1, to play some lands, and then I actually think he would have been a good CSGO player. I think he could have, but put it this way, now he could have actually been in like a Team Liquid for real. That would have been where he could have had like an OC type call up, and this could be his time. So obviously he was a real prospect in CSGO. If people don't know, Leaf was like a potential prospect. His problem was he was, like his name, he's just a little fucking guy, and he's barely been in esports. Like, he was just way too young, guys. You have to realize, I think he was like 16 when he was in that bloody team that was going, the Chaos team. Was he super young?
18 now. He's 18
There
now.
we go. He must have been 16 then, yeah. So as a result, I can't even comment on him in CSGO. He didn't have enough time, basically. So if you look at the squad, then you look at the people they used to have. They used to have Floppy, they used to have Vice, like Tens. Like, they're going for skill in this team. They clearly go on this angle. So give me your thoughts on the current lineup, dusT.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I don't know if they kind of fell into that by chance, though, because a lot of these guys, they were trying because they already had them on contract from the CSGO team, remember? That's
I see, yes,
and
true.
Zeppa and stuff came over.
They just shifted them over, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then also a lot of these guys had played together before in CS on Chaos, if you remember. When Steel departed to go to Valorant, you know, Vanity, Zeppa, and Leaf were still the core of Chaos that remained.
That was, if people don't know, that's why Vanity became a leader, because when Steel left, he just took the gig over in CSGO.
Yeah, I think he was already like the secondary caller of the team anyway.
Would make
so
sense.
It was just a natural progression for him. But then coming over into Valorant, the opportunity just wasn't there for him to play initially because he was a little bit later to the game than like Leaf and Zeppa, so he winds up going to version 1, leads that team to some success, actually, got the international event, the first one, and then he kind of pivots over to get that chance to play with his old teammates again. And yeah, Cloud9 is just good. They are just so good in every respect of the game. In almost every role, they have a fantastic player fulfilling that role, like Vanity, solid controller IGL, Zeta, amazing Sova breach flex, just so smart, so good at using his utility, and also I think people sleep on his fragging a little bit. Yeah, there's other brighter stars in this team, but Zeta's stable fragging definitely is kind of another backbone to the team. You have the Zeppa Leaf combo, which I think the most deadly entry force in the game right now, and they still get some good, support as well from Mitch, who's shown a lot of flexibility in what agents he can play and what roles he can pivot to as needed. I think this team's found the perfect combination of how they rotate Leaf and Zeppa based on the map, on like who's playing the duelist and who's playing the more supportive element. In fact, I think people are so high on Leash Jet, they don't realize how many other agents this guy can play to a high level. He's playing Viper. He's playing all kinds of stuff. Like, it's wild to see the diversity that Leaf can bring to the table. Their fragging is stable on everyone. And I think what Cloud9, what sets them apart for me is, yeah, they have all the strats. Yeah, they can be super explosive. That's one of their big strengths, is just how aggressive they can be and how efficient they can be with that aggression. But the one thing that Cloud9 does better than any team in NA is when shit goes down, when stuff starts getting really chaotic in the mid round, you're in that tight 3-on-3 situation, you know, things are all over the place. They are so good at making that like mid round audible on a snap, and they're so decisive with it. Like, if they're like, oh, this isn't working, bam, let's pivot to the other side, or no, let's commit here. Like, the way that they handle those mid round moments is just so pristine.
They never look unsure.
Really is another team that it's unbelievable how they do it. It must really just come down to how good their team playing communication is and just the chemistry overall the team, which has been indicated in interviews multiple times that Vanity wanted to be with Leaf and Zeppa because they love playing together, and they're always on the same page. And so most teams, when you get those mid-round chaotic moments, you there are times in this game where no matter how prepared you are, you must be able to do something on the fly. You must be able to make that snap-second decision that wins you the round. And Cloud9 are the best at that in North America, hands down.
What do you think?
I just think that, so I got really taken by Cloud9 during Champs. And yeah, basically everything that dusT just said kind of encompasses like why I really enjoyed them, because it felt like they always had a plan for something. It felt like the way that they combined what they had. Like, I mean, look, I am very, very vocal about the fact that Zeppa is my favorite player just to watch. I think Zeppa is incredible.
Okay.
And the way that I love that we talk about Zeppa and Leaf as like this duo and how they play around each other as like who's playing the duelist, you know, stuff like that. But actually for me, like the two that I would always talk about in terms of how they kind of work together is Xeppaa and Zeta, because even though they are, Xeppaa's playing this like flex role, so he's kind of like your secondary duelist, he's playing initiators a lot of the time, because Zeta is oftentimes playing that Sova, a lot of their utility usage has to really be like in conjunction with one another, especially if Xeppaa is also playing an initiator, right? Like you need those things to be, whether it's spread out across a map or used at different times, like really like coordinated, because, things like drones, trailblazers, they do similar jobs, whatever. And I always felt like they had a really nice rhythm in how they use their utility to be able to have the most widespread support and information gathering for the rest of the team, and specifically for people like Leaf. And you've obviously also got to consider that Mitch, who's playing the Sentinel, he's going to be on a different part of the site, like whether he's anchoring or lurking, whatever side that you're on, that's also providing extra information. And it always feels like Cloud9, A, have an abundance of information to go by, but B, as dusT kind of alluded to, and this is the really nice thing about them, is that they'll always make a really decisive decision. Which is a dumb way of putting it, decisive decision. But
we know what you mean.
Yeah,
we get it.
Right.
Decisive call or whatever, then yeah, sure.
They're always going to be very decisive. And when I compare that to a team like, and maybe this is a bit unfair because I see, even though this team is qualified for playoffs, I sort of see them on the other end of the ladder. That is Knights. I think that one of the big problems that you see with a team like Knights is like, when they kind of don't have the information or they're unsure, they sort of stall and they're kind of, whatever. And I think that's really easy to exploit. So I think Cloud9 really represent like the superior end of how to react in those kinds of situations.
They never look lost. That's the biggest thing. Like,
Okay.
I feel like they never have a situation where they can't handle the moment. Like,
I've got the analogy for your dusT. Here we go. Isn't this the old school Luminosity SK from CSGO? If people don't know, what they essentially pioneered was anytime it was ever a 2v2 or a 3v3, their 2 or their 3 looked like they could, like they'd taken a time out and just agreed what they were going to do, even though they're obviously doing it on the fly or from a call, and famously, essentially that's how they won 2 majors. It's not even that they were like better than everyone else overall. This one area, you can imagine, think about how many big matches this is going to happen in, something that goes wrong in the game, your setup doesn't work, someone dies early. Like, they were the best at getting out of trouble in that sense,
Yeah, think of like Cloud9 as LG if they weren't as default driven.
Right.
I feel like that LG team was like very defaulty and
for
slower
sure
paced into those mid-round moments. Whereas I feel like with Vanity's team, they always have like an initial goal at the beginning of the round. And I feel like you kind of have to in this game because you're fighting for orb or you're fighting for early map control with like the whole force field mechanic of the game. And so they're a little bit more up tempo than a team like that. But yeah, certainly when it comes to like those mid-round moments, like the 3-on-3s, the small number of situations, yeah, just they're always on the same page, it feels like, man. Like there's just like this weird flow that goes on that's just, you can't really pinpoint it, and it's hard to really like just fully discuss and kind of summarize, but it's just there. When you watch them play, you can just feel it like, okay, they know what they're doing here.
I also just really want to, so I think that Vanity is just I think he's a fantastic caller. I think he's fantastic in the role that he plays. But one thing I really enjoy about the way that Vanity plays is that because of Cloud9's like really solid info gathering, Vanity could be like on a lurk on the other side of the map. And the way that he'll like, let's say rotate round to join the rest of the team if they've like decided what site it is that they're going to be going to or whatever, he can do it in such a way where he will almost like help trap opponents, right? So they can really use the space that that opponents have gained for themselves against them just because of how they like have Vanity like return back to the team or whatever, and because of how well he plays those lurks and doesn't get caught early, and then has he will like exploit that space like against opponents, which I think is something that a lot of teams aren't necessarily as good at. But it's almost always, you can tell like with the placement of, for example, Star, and again, this is kind of in the context of the meta where like we're seeing a lot of Astra play and a lot more abundance of stars available to you. But like the placement of stars and things like that, you can see that they will have already considered those positions and whatever for the opponents earlier on in the round, and that they're kind of planning for this eventuality. And I think Vanity just does that so well.
And I think that this meta is only going to make that stronger for Vanity, because he's going to have a more mobile controller that's going to allow him to close that distance even faster on those lurks and get back with his team and not have to be as back, to set things up. The only difference is like now he might have to be more with the team on key executes, because the utility is not going to be as global as it was with Astra, of course. So that's going to limit his ability to space away from his team. But, the Omen ult, for example, is going to give him opportunities to like do aggro lurks, get back to his team if need be, things of that nature. So that's a team that I can just see persisting through this meta shift.
I think you characterize it well, though, that it does infer that basically his team is comming them correctly at the info of what's going on their part of the map, because there's another reason to tag into that thing I said before about the way the in-game leaders used to be set up. The other reason they tended to put themselves in the entry pack in the modern day is because then you're just seeing what's going on. You don't need as much info communicated to you. Because actually, that point you said earlier about like the premise that the Rainbow Six guy had of like, as the game went on, would an in-game leader speak less? I actually do. That's a principle I actually have thought about a lot in Counter-Strike particularly, which is that basically, in my opinion, what you're talking about there, I call that like a broken game situation where it's like a 2v2 or a 2-on-3 or a 3v3, but it's like whatever you were both doing at the beginning of the round is already like finished, or it broke, or it didn't work, you didn't get on the site, you didn't plant the spike, all that shit, right? Basically in that scenario, obviously the point is you're in a unique situation that you've never been in exactly that situation on the map of so you have to make a decision on the fly, right? Basically, from what I've found is that actually the best teams don't need to come very much there. It's like they already kind of know what everyone wants to do, they know what their teammate would want to do. The idea is you either have a really good IGL who just makes like a decisive call, or people just like with very simple comms can sort of figure out what to do, whereas you actually find, even though it'd look impressive to a fan, if I showed them like a demo where the guy's playing a scrim and he's comming constantly, that's usually actually a sign that you don't have very good comms, and actually the structure of the team's not that great. That's why you're having to like essentially all micro each other and give every piece of info, whereas I do kind of find that like the best teams, the premise is it's not that they said everything genius, they just kind of knew what each other were going to do. They're on the same page. I can see why you're bigging this team up as the number one team then. So, sounds like everything's squared away for this to be their time.
They're just de facto right now. I mean, who else would you argue is number one in North America? You'd have a hard time trying to argue against Cloud9 based on the results.
The closest thing would be V1, but
that's fair.
Which is why actually, so not only do I assume they're going to get to the grand finals, I'm also hoping they do, because I want to see that game. I actually want an answer to that question. Like, who is going to perform better out of Cloud9 and V1 if, when they go up against each other.
Oh, man. A lot of storylines there for sure.
Yeah, no, it would be awesome. And then obviously if we get to the point of them going to Masters, I'm going to assume that Fnatic are also going to qualify for Masters. I would love to see Cloud9 versus Fnatic. And I think that would also be a great international matchup to see them go to, because while I think that pretty solidly Cloud9 are the best team in North America right now, are they the best team in the world? Don't know.
No telling. That's the thing about Valorant, is we don't get international competition as much. You have to really weigh more on the ones.
You've got to theory craft it all.
The world champions are out. They're not going to be at LAN, so there is some room there.
Indeed. Right, what about this then? Since it's a team we've barely talked about, I thought since when you were doing the rankings, where they're at, what about this XSET team then? So based on what you're saying, it sounds like they're also a team that's slightly on the wrong side of the bubble to get one of these spots, but it's not impossible, right? If everything comes together, right? Where is this team at the moment, dusT? Who is XSET right now?
Yeah, so XSET's a team that I always labeled them as forever the bridesmaid and never the bride, because throughout the course of last year, they were always one spot away from qualifying for LAN or something like that. They were a team that was always successful throughout all three stages of VCT. They would always qualify for the next step on their first attempt, so they didn't have to go through additional qualifiers, things of that nature. So they were always right there. I think they were always in the mix of being top 5. And I think the other good thing about XSET is I feel like every move that they have made has made them a better team. They've managed the roster so well throughout the course of their time together. Bringing in dusT and Zekken was a fantastic pickup after BCJ was a fantastic pickup prior to that. Then obviously they brought in cryocells now, has added even more firepower to the team. And so they just progressively gotten better and better with each roster move. But it's just, there's still always one or two teams that are better than them fighting for that spot, right? Right now, the thing denying XSET is this guard team. The guard team beat them in VCT in the group stage multiple times, as well as in qualifiers. And so that's kind of been their hurdle. That's why they're kind of sitting in the bubble, but they're still in the middle of the group. But they're a team to me that is incredibly talented. I think the Zek and Cryo combo is almost just as deadly as any other duo in North America as far as like taking map control, creating openings, things of that nature. I think BCJ is an incredibly crafty, like Sova, breach main. I mean, I think that his individual form has not been as strong as it was last year, this year, but it's still, you can very much see the potential. You can still very much see what he's able to do for the team from like a supportive element. I think that they're led well by dusT. I think dusT was a great pickup as far as kind of orchestrating the team. I think they've actually gotten progressively better at mid-round situations than they were last year as well. I think they're handling those moments a little bit better. So honestly, I feel like everything is set up for them to be a fantastic team and for them to potentially qualify for LAN. It's just some of these other teams just kind of edge them out in some really tight games, man. Like they're always right there on the cusp, in my opinion, of breaking through. Again, I think they have the talent. I think they have the structure. I think they have the playmaking. You know, tactics are pretty good. It's just a team like Cloud9 is a little bit more refined in the mid-round moments, for example. Or the guard's been a little bit more impressive at how they use their utility. So it's like they're always just like right there, but there's just always someone that seems to edge them out a little bit.
My kind of hope for XSET is that because they've made like these roster switches and whatnot, and like Cryo is relatively new on the roster, that after some development time, we might have like a bit more of a definite answer as to like, you know, where are they better than when we're looking at comparing them to the teams that are above them. And in the case of this group, it was C9 and the Guard. Like, where are their strengths against those specific opponents and what can they lean on? I think that there's still, there has definitely been improvement. I'm a big fan of Cryo. I think he's a fantastic Jet player. And also Zekken, I think, is a really great Raze player. And so having like a really solid sort of like entry kind of duo is really strong for them. But because like having that as a duo and having that as something you're playing around in the team is still relatively new to this team, I don't think that they should be too like dismayed by the fact that they're maybe not like top 4 and that they don't really know where they are in terms of like top 5 or top 6 or whatever, because I think that especially if you compare them to, we've been talking about them as like sort of on the same line as Sentinels in terms of like one of them is the top 5. The answer is just 2. If you look at the trajectories of these two teams and just how it feels like their improvement or not improvement is going, I would say that XSET have had like a relatively upward trajectory, whereas Sentinels feel like they're on a slight downward trajectory, and as we discussed earlier, we don't really know what the solution to that is. So for me, I think that there's still like optimism to be like derived from the situation with XSET, even though they're probably just not quite good enough to be able to like get the one up on teams like the Guard and teams like Cloud9. But yeah, I don't know. I think that, as you say, like dusT is great. dusT is one of these players who, again, like I think should be looked at as we go into this new patch, just because of how he likes to play Astra. I want to see how he fares on those other controllers. Yeah, I think that they have those strengths. It's just, can they get them to a point where there is like the same level of depth, I think is the best way of putting it compared to the other teams.
I mean, Zekken and Cryo are incredibly young, not only in like literal age, but how much they've been playing at like a top level.
Pretty
of
inexperienced, right? Yeah.
Right. Like I think Zekken's literally only like 16 or 17 years old or something like that. So like he wasn't even able to play VCT last year due to age. So yeah, he's
I also noticed their team, in contrast, put it this way, unlike, I think it was the Optic team I said, unlike that, their team, the only player from CSGO Geo is dusT, actually. The other players, like I saw 2 of them, one of them comes from like Apex Legends, the other one comes from like fucking Crossfire or something. Which to be fair, Crossfire is sort of like an Asian rip-off of Counter-Strike, I will say. It's not dissimilar, but then the other players, as far as I can tell, are just native to Valorant. So the one concern I would have is this. A team like that, the concern would be if they qualify, you know, do they make it on the LAN? Like, will people have the experience to sort of hold up and be good? Like, the downside is you never know. Whereas you look at a team like Sentinels, like, look how experienced a lot of their players are, you know.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Like, I think that because they haven't made it to the LAN yet, like, while some of their guys have probably done it in the past, like, dusT obviously has played a ton of LANs and CS in his career, the other guys don't really have that same level. And I think the other thing for me, for XSET, is, like, Aaron, I feel like has just been... It's been a tough for him because he's had to constantly pivot his role to make room for the next player. And so I feel like he's obviously still has potential to pop off. Like he still can have a big game here and there, but I feel like he's the one that's been most hard done by some of these roster changes.
He's the sacrificial sort of lamb when you bring in the new guy, right?
Yeah, like he's kind of still holding on though. Like I've actually been impressed by like how he's been able to mold himself into different roles to kind of adjust the rest of the team. Again, I think for them it's just going to be like consistency against top level opposition. That's going to be the problem because I think that they're definitely they're almost like gatekeepers of the top 5. I feel like in North America. Like you have to be really good to beat XSET, but some of the most impressive teams from an eye test are beating them. Like they have beaten the Guard before. So it's possible that they could beat the Guard in this playoff bracket, but the last 2 times they've met, the Guards won that matchup and it's looked a little bit more impressive. And obviously you favor Cloud9 over them. You probably favor Optic over them, maybe. I think I'd favor XSET over Sentinels, like for that spot.
Yeah.
But I just think like Cloud9 version 1 in particular just look a little bit better from the eye test right now against XSET. But again, I would not be shocked to see XSET come out second or something to Cloud9 and still find their way to land. It's just the way that things have been shaking down so far, it just seems like the more favorite candidate to do that would be a team like version 1 or maybe the Guard.
By the way, I'll even give you like the quick background on dusT in that sense. He actually is an example of someone who did swap to the IGL role. He used to essentially be like a supportive or entry player in the old complexity lineups. If people don't know, he actually moved from the UK to America years and years and years ago. We're talking like 5-6 years ago now, and was someone who was committed to living in America and trying to make it at tier 1. His problem was his team was sort of at the kind of level I was talking about with the year team, because fully if they were on the same squad at one point in time. And basically, he was the guy where he swapped to being the in-game leader. And this is what's interesting. In CSGO, he was again capped at that level. Like no one wanted to bring him to the other big squads because unfortunately, actually, a downside in CSGO of being an in-game leader is unless you're like unless there's kind of like an eye test for how good you are as an IGL, as in people can sort of see that you're brilliant and you're doing all this amazing shit. You tend to essentially just bring up players. You get like competitive, and then the other in-game leaders just take your star players with their bigger orgs and more money, and then you start all over again, and you sort of like in some sort of like Sisyphus's fucking myth of Sisyphus like hell, where you're just pushing a boulder up the hill every day and then seeing it roll down. Because he was sort of unfortunate in CSGO in that spot. But I will say the interesting detail, if you're a Valorant fan, is he was someone where, despite the fact the public never really like vibed to him or thought he was good or his name wasn't very relevant, a lot of his teammates like did actually used to rave about him. You remember dusT? Like he had a lot of teammates who thought he was like a really hard worker and had like a good mindset and stuff. So I could see him being someone who, if he's committed himself, as by now blossomed into a true in-game leader, would make sense. He's been doing it quite a few years now. I think like 3 or 4 at least, right? I think it was after Stanislaus period, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely tell a difference between like pre-def and post-def when it comes to XSET and how they play the game. And I think they've only progressively gotten better at how they play the game, particularly in their mid-round situations. So it does seem like he's definitely been able to develop into.
The only thing is, I was always worried in CSGO that he was a little bit mechanically dodgy. I wasn't a big fan of like his fragging, basically.
He's definitely like, of the IGLs in North America, I think you put like ShahZaM and Xander kind of at the top as far as like fragging capability. But I would say dusT is like not bad. Like he's not like I think he can definitely have some big games. He's definitely up there. I think he's kind of similar to Vanity, where like they definitely can contribute. They can kind of be like middle of the pack players, but they certainly aren't burdens by any means. So yeah, I think his fragging's actually up to stuff in Valorant.
Yeah, just looking at from the game they played against XSET, the roughest map that they had in that series was on Fracture, which was a 13-3 to the Guard. The game they played against XSET, the game they played against the Guard. But dusT was the like he had the highest ACS from that game, and yeah, the highest like kills and assists. So it definitely he has that. Whereas like sometimes you see, there are some controllers who are just never going to be up there, right? Which is totally fine as long as they're doing their role properly. But I kind of like agree with your assessment a little bit about Aaron as well. Obviously, as you mentioned, like he's been playing a lot of Viper recently, which is fine. And he plays as like Sentinel stuff as well. Like previously he's played like a lot of Killjoy and whatever. But it does make me wonder, like given the fact that Cryo is playing quite a bit of Chamber right now, and Viper is probably going to quite precipitously drop out the meta unless you're playing on a map like Breeze or whatever, and maybe Bind. Like where is his strength gonna be? That's kind of like, unless it's like map dependent and it's like, okay, we want a Killjoy, let's like play a Killjoy here. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I do wonder like how much he is gonna be able to provide, just given that awkward spot he seems to be in between everyone else's like preferred agents.
Yeah, I would say at least he's proven that he's malleable, right? I mean, this guy used to be one of their duelist players, right? For the long time, he was the one playing the Raze. He also played some other duelists in the past. He's played Sage in the past. He's played controllers in the past for a brief period when he was playing a little bit of Astra before Def joined the team. So I think that's the one thing going for them is like he's proven that he's got the mentality to pivot when need be, and he's been able to do so successfully. Maybe he's been weaker on certain agents than other agents. Don't get me wrong. Like sometimes you're just not going to get to play to your strengths when you're on this team. But I have confidence that it's not like I think he needs to get removed or something like that. I'm not saying that's what you're implying, but I just think that he's the track record's pretty good for him being able to adapt. I'm not sure what you adapt him to. That's definitely a good question. But the fact that he's proven that he can flex is certainly strong because you can kind of set everything else up and then be like, okay, Aaron, we kind of need you to do this. And he seems to have the mentality. Like when I've watched him do like post-game interviews, like he's all about whatever the team needs and like whatever. And he's very upbeat. He's very positive. Like he comes off like he's very talkative too on interviews. Like he just comes off as like a very positive person, which is always nice as well.
Okay.
To be fair, like on the most recent series that they played, the one against Luminosity, like he did stick to the Viper on both of the maps that they played. One of them was Breeze, so like, take that as you will. And they never got around to playing Bind, but like they were one of these teams that still had the Astra Viper, so it could just be, I did mention that they changed the way that they played the Astra and Viper in that series and sort of adapted the playstyle rather than changing the agents. So it could just be that we see him stick to that and that we do still see like Viper be played by him or whatever. But I wonder like how long also like if they're just gonna do that and change the playstyle, like how long can that be sustained as all of the other teams start to change their ways?
I think the other caveat that you kind of have to add to that is how quick this patch came in. Like it literally came in after 4 games of group stage as the last game of the regular group stage. So a lot of teams didn't have, I don't think, that much time to prepare anything different. And so I think a lot of teams were kind of sticking to their guns on what they knew kind of still worked. And so I think now that we've had a little bit of a gap between then and playoffs, now you'll be able to see, okay, do teams really want to stick with Astra and Viper, or was it more about a necessity because they just didn't have time to prepare something else? So I think that's going to be something to keep an eye on.
One thing I thought would be an interesting last topic we can do, because it's got a lot of nice, potentially abstract stuff we can bring in here, and people can come from any game angle, is I want to ask dusT, like, how would you contrast the way, because obviously another interesting thing there is a similarity to CS is the map pick ban veto, which is basically a similar concept. But the key thing is this, if people don't know, in Counter-Strike for many years now, basically since I think it's from 2014 onwards, we've had a 7 map pool and we never go down or up. We just change maps in and out. Like we might take out a map and bring a different one, but it always stays 7. And the veto system is always the same. You do your veto first, you pick, and then you do a second veto, then you do the decider map, right? So you go down through the 7 art. So as a result, effectively, the CSGO meta for many years goes like this. If you want to be a champion, you probably need to be pretty good at 5 of the 7, if not like decent on the 6th still, so you can have one that you can permanently ban. And typically the top teams all have one map that they permanently ban no matter what. Then, if you're the smaller teams, that's where you create the matchups. Like, this team's number 9 and they're playing number 3, but you know what? The maps they're really good on is going to be in the overlap, and so they're going to play it in the series, and that's where you create the good matchups. How have you found it thus far in Valorant, dusT? Like, how has it worked in terms of the map pool? How do the teams, like, are they more cynical in terms of, like, they do it based on, like, the agents they're going to play? How do people approach, like, how they're setting up the structure? Because we kind of got it all nailed down in CS, and we know the way it's going to go, don't we?
Well, it's only been recently that we've had 7 maps in Valorant, right? I mean, but prior to that, we were kind of sitting on like 5, and then we got a couple of more, and then we got a couple of more. And then it's also a situation where like some of the maps are just kind of like wonky, like Fracture is just completely different than any other map and how it plays and like how it's set up. Okay. That some teams are okay with that and kind of want to try it out. Some teams are like, nah, I'll pass on that one. So that's been kind of an interesting little...
are there a lot of permabans in Valorant, or is it more specific to the opponent?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, there are definitely some teams that definitely have permaban. There's some teams that try to float, but a lot of situations do still come up, like you're talking about in CS, where their team has a permaban. Maybe 2 teams share the same permaban, so both float to the second rotation. Yes. You kind of play a little bit of gamesmanship on that. So there's definitely some of that. I just think that there's so many moving parts in Valorant that it adds complications to that. Like in CS, the map pool and your pick ban phase was like the literal biggest decisions that you made, I feel like, in a series. Whereas in this game, you have different agents, you have different metas, you have different compositions you might want to do. And so the map is just another variable in a long list of things things you have to consider that make Valorant a little bit more complicated as far as like how things are going to shake down and what makes the most sense. I feel like you can't focus on your map pool as much as you have to just focus on figuring out how to incorporate new agents and how to build compositions. Right. It just adds even more difficulty, I think, when it comes to map pool. But yeah, there's definitely still permabans. There's definitely still teams that are kings on certain maps, and you kind of still, that's their map, that's their home turf. But there's definitely a lot more like middle ground, I think, in CS. Just because, like I said, because you have to focus on so many other things, you know, like the map pool is a little bit tougher to kind of capitalize on it, especially because there are just certain maps that, you know, and with Fracture, it's just completely foreign. So you got that going on. Then you have a map like Icebox that honestly was stale as all get out, and everyone basically played it the same in North America.
Oh,
and so
played it a billion times, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just like one of those things where that was just kind of like hard to say who was the best on that map because everyone kind of played it similarly.
That's like the dusT 2 of your map pool, basically. Yeah,
it's just like, whatever. I don't really know where to go with that one. Now that's obviously maybe going to change because Icebox has been tweaked and we haven't seen enough games to know how it's going to play now, but that's how it was in the past. It's the most stale map of the pool, in my opinion. So yeah, I don't know. Like, it's one of those things where you definitely have some similarities to CS and how it can kind of all shake down and how it all operates, but the maps are just so different from each other in this game compared to CS, where like you could see similarities between like a Mirage and a dusT 2 and so on and so forth, where you don't really get that as much in Valorant. Each map is very distinct in some way.
Because you know that's the part that used to drive me crazy about Overwatch, Gio, is that all the people in the game didn't come from CS, so they were all just cool with being told, like, here are the maps you'll be playing.
Yes,
and then they're like, oh yeah, no problem.
Them.
It was crazy, wasn't it? Like, I used to think...
them per stage, right? It's
and
like,
you would sometimes
the
see...
next stage of, like, or the next week of Overwatch League, it was different.
When you'd look on, like, Wikipedia or whatever at the upcoming matches, you'd even see a match and you'd go, like, holy shit, like, that one map being assigned, just giving this other team, like, a way better chance of winning this game, but the fans just treated it like, you know, it was like...
I totally forgot about it.
It didn't matter. It was so weird, wasn't it? So I wondered what you thought of like the Valorant setup in that regard.
Yeah, so it's interesting from my perspective. So right now in Valorant, now that we actually have enough maps to be able to have a real map veto system, for me, I think the real important thing right now is that teams cannot afford to not like both Breeze and Fracture, because when Breeze first came into the map veto system, a lot of teams, that was the permaban. Like, they were like, nope, don't want to play it, not interested. Now that Fracture's also in the map pool, it's like, you can't afford to hate both of them. Like, you can have one of them as your permaban, but you've got to be able to play at least one of them. And so we have seen both of them actually, like, in a lot more rotation. I think obviously people have had more time to learn Breeze and get more comfortable with it. But yeah, you see them way more than, like, when Breeze first came out, it was almost as if it, you know, it was the the bastard child you swept under the rug kind of thing. Right. But it's interesting to me because from the perspective of, like, having come from Rainbow Six, like, Rainbow Six is also in this really weird spot between what you guys describe with CS and what's happening with Valorant and whatever, because map vetoes are very, very important in Rainbow Six. Rainbow Six has always had a 7-map pool, and people have been begging for it to go up to a 9-map pool, and they finally upped it to a 9-map pool now, which is great. But the thing with Rainbow Six is you have your operator bans and whatever, and you have your operator picks, and you have your map veto, like other games. But in Rainbow Six, because you change your operators every round, like, you pick which operators you're playing every single round, like, the importance of map versus like whether this map demands a certain operator, like whatever, is a little bit different to how dusT you just described in Valorant. Because I think in Rainbow Six you would argue that your capability on a map is way more important than anything else, because you can change and adapt what you're doing with your characters, like, in the game. Like, if something's not working with this composition, we just do a different one next round. And certain, like, sites on different maps, because you pick which site you're going to play on before the round starts. When certain, like, sites will lend themselves to certain compositions, certain operators, whatever, and that will, of course, provide strengths and weaknesses. But I think that it was very uncomfortable for me, like, when Valorant did still have, like, the really small map pool, because having been in games where there are enough maps, like, obviously there are huge flaws with the way the Overwatch did theirs, but, like, having come from games where there are enough maps to have, like, a proper, like, map pool, it felt really odd to have, like, this weird sort of half map pool where, like, especially at Masters 3, where it was like one of the teams would just get more like control over the map veto, because there weren't the right number of maps for both of them to have even amount of control over the map veto. And I found that so like strange, because that's still kind of RNG, you know, like it's still not entirely whatever. So I suppose my TLDR is like, I'm glad that there's at least 7 maps now. And I think that as they continue to add more, I will be curious to see if they do like a Rainbow Six style thing where they limit it to like, here is our 7 map pool, and they take certain maps in and out, especially if they want to like rework any, like Icebox has just had or whatever. Or if it will just be like, okay, here are all the maps and you can like just choose whichever the fuck ones you want.
Because the problem is that, oh yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, if I had to guess, it'll be stage dependent. I think they'll set the pool each stage or something. Once it gets to that point,
Yeah, the thing to say is this. One thing is, like, just what dusT said there. You have to remember, Riot Games have their own philosophy on how they design and balance from League of Legends. You've seen the way they do it, right? And one of the things that they love to do in League of Legends is essentially cycle what champions are played, because they want them, for the cynical business side, they want people to buy the skins of the champions. They want people to buy the champion and play it. So they have to find a way to sort of keep, like, turnover in the meta, basically. And so I would imagine something similar. Like, if I had to guess, it would be like you say there. Maybe you get eventually like 10 maps, but it's like, you know, stage 1 is these 7 and the next one's this one, and it'd be a way to essentially create not only a theme, but it's a way, if you then the people playing casually, it's a reason to that you now have to play the map that's just come in the map pool. It keeps it fresh in that regard. Then there's the other thing, which is this. In general, from what I've seen, it doesn't seem to me like you would want to do what they said in Rainbow Six, because that's a famous thing people who are fans, who are very casual, often asked in CSGO, like, should we add more maps? And it's like, remember the thing I said at the beginning, where usually even the best team in the world has a permaban or has like one map they just don't want to play. Like typically in Counter-Strike, we found you can't really go beyond 7, because at that point, you just have too many times in the series where there'd be like 3 maps I can't play. And so then like essentially the bracket would almost decide the tournament, you know, wouldn't be as much the teams. The reason why I'm interested though is because this actually makes Valorant probably a way more complicated game than fans realise. Because think about this. The balance philosophy of Counter-Strike is the guns pretty much stay the same, and you just essentially the map is what can change. You change the map pool to make the game more interesting. Meanwhile, if you go to League of Legends, there is only one map. It's the same twisted fucking tree line. Well, it's not called that. It's called Summoner's Rift or whatever the fuck they call it. There's Summoner's Rift, right? But you change the characters, right? Valorant's trying to do both at the same time. So that means essentially, say I am the best Breach team. The problem is if the wrong patch comes in next month, maybe we're not using the agents that make me the best on Breach. And so tomorrow, when that patch drops, I'm actually not the best on Breach, but I don't know until I go on the match. So it actually sounds like this element's going to be very complicated. This is like trying to spin plates and keep them all going at once, you know.
I think that in Valorant, like there is an extent where, you know, if you want to be, and again, like I would personally look at it more from like a role perspective than a specific agent perspective, but it's like, if you want to be like a really good initiator or flex player, like let's say you're like a Sky Breach kind of person, like there are going to be maps where you'd rather play Sky, and there are going to be maps where you'd rather play Breach. And there are maps where you could in theory play either one, and it is down to your preference, like Haven, for example, like you could argue that either are viable on that. But like, I think that the way that the maps are designed in Valorant is they are all very specifically supposed to have wildly different geometry. And the way that a lot of the agents' kit is designed is to kind of work with different kinds of geometry. So like the reason why, at least personally, you know, I think the Breach is great on Fracture and Haven is because you have a lot of these very like narrow corridors, but that also run quite close to each other, and a lot of his utility can be used through walls.
Oh yeah, I obviously meant Breeze, by the way, not Breach when I said the map, of course. Yeah,
well, either way, like I'll make my point. So like,
you get what I meant. Yeah, go on, keep going.
The point is that because like all of these maps are designed with very specific, like some of them have like gimmicks, right? Like very specific gimmicks or very like different geometries and stuff. There is always going to be a demand there for you to be able to play different agents in your role, and unless you're like really staunchly a one-trick jet player, but even then that's like kind of spreading out a little bit now, especially with the advent of Chamber, right? So I think that regardless of kind of the point that you made, if you're someone who can't play different agents in your role well, you're kind of screwed anyway. Like, I don't think there's ever going to be an instance where it's like, oh, we're like really specialist on this specific agent, therefore we want to play it on every map. But every map's not going to suit that agent. Right. So yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I totally agree with that. Like you kind of see it happen with the controller meta shift, right? When Astra became prevalent, it's like, listen, I don't care how good you are in Omen and Brim, you have to be able to play Astra because she can impact the game so much.
Right.
And we need that. We need that in our arsenal. And so yeah, you definitely have to be adaptable. And the players who are the most adaptable are the ones who are usually the most successful in this game, in my opinion. Like you said, Jet's been so strong for so damn long that like, yeah, you could literally just be a Jet one trick and probably do really well if that's the role that you play. But for virtually everything else, like we saw Cypher really fall out of favor, for example, and people had to kind of pivot how they play the Sentinel role. We saw Viper become more prevalent. We had to have someone that had to fill that role because maps like Icebox and Breeze in particular demand that agent because of how much her toxic screen can cover ground as opposed to literally any other controller because the choke points are so wide or the gaps are so wide on the sites that simple smokes won't do the trick. Like you need to have that type of situation. And so, yeah, that requires some learning. I think mostly though, and maybe you'll disagree with me on this, Gio. This is a tough one, but I do think that some people overhype how hard it is to learn a new agent. I think there are certain agents that require good mechanics to be able to master, like satchels on Rays or how you use Jet's mechanics or something like that. Like, don't get me wrong; those do require a little bit of a learning curve. And yeah, some agents also require like lineups, like learning all the different lineups for like your snake bites or your Molotov or whatever the case from Brimstone, or obviously Sova has like a million freaking lineups for the recon bolt and stuff like that. So that requires learning. But mechanically speaking, it's more about the mentality shift of like being willing to take on that new role to help your team out, as opposed to like it physically being difficult to learn how to play a different agent. For example, like I don't think it's that hard to switch between Omen and Brimstone from a mechanical standpoint. It's more about positioning and timing and lineups and things of that nature to set up your team. So you just have to be willing to do that, I guess, is the point, in order to fulfill what the meta requires and, kind of what your team needs for that particular situation.
I guess my input on that would be, as someone who is really, really like mechanically bad, I don't really like have much of an opinion on whether it's mechanically difficult, but to switch between those agents. But I actually think that's kind of irrelevant because I think that being able to play multiple agents and adapt and whatever is a part of being successful at the game. And so if you want to be on a team and you want to be successful at the game, you don't have a choice. Like you need to learn how to do it. And absolutely, if someone has recently switched over to a new agent and they're learning it, you'll probably notice that in the way that they play. And at least as like a caster and an analyst, I personally would be a bit more forgiving on them, and you would just draw a storyline from that, right? You're like, right, you can see they're trying to adapt, like blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to like totally shit on them and be like, wow, they shouldn't be in this fucking game. Like they're awful. No, of course it's going to take time to get used to it, like practice, like anything that you have to master. But I think like the issue would come where if a player were like, no, I refuse to do that because like, that's difficult, or like, oh, then why you're in the wrong career.
I think the biggest pivot was the second duelist having the flex to KO Sky was probably the biggest example of this, where a lot of teams in NA were running double duelist compositions and doing so to a very high degree. But eventually people did realize the importance of having something like a Breach or a Sky or a KO.
Everyone wanted to play Rays. Like
so like a lot of duelists had to make that pivot. And like those agents require learning lineups, learning timings. Like it's more of I'm just saying it's like more of a mentality thing than like oh my God, I actually have to learn like whole new mechanics to play this agent. Like, no, it's more of just like being willing to do the homework, learn your lineups, learn your timings, study film, things of that nature to figure out like what's going to work best. And some people have struggled with that, pivoting from the secondary duelist to more of a flex role. And some teams have really thrived because they've had a player who's been able to do that really well. And so, yeah, I think that is always going to be something to keep an eye out with Valorant, because we know that this meta is going to constantly evolve.
I would actually be really curious to know what percentage of players who struggle with that came from Counter-Strike as opposed to having more experience in hero shooters. Because I think if you look at something like Overwatch, if you look, even like Rainbow Six, which I wouldn't really call a hero shooter, but like it has those same things, is you will always have like your primary role, what you prefer to play, but you people with experience in those kinds of games will know that in different meta shifts, you will have to stretch outside of that role. In Overwatch, there were times where you would play double main tank instead of a main tank and an off tank. When you went to GOATs, you had your
no more DPS players.
Right,
yeah,
your
exactly.
hit scan DPS would typically play Zarya, who is an off tank, and your projectile DPS would move on to like Brig, which is a support player, support character, right? In Rainbow Six, I think seeing role switches is a little bit more well received. Like, I've seen people switch from being like primary entry to going to hard support because that's what the meta is demanded, and the way that their players' skill sets work out is to kind of slightly shift things over. And I think that people who have experience in those sorts of games will sort of understand a bit better that that is part of the necessity of playing those games. And whereas obviously Counter-Strike not having that aspect to it, it's not a hero shooter. You don't have sets of abilities and
every character's identical.
It's like the roles in Counter-Strike are, for lack of a better term, self-inflicted, right? It's like there is an idea what an entry role is, but because everyone sort of has the same things available to them, those are roles that are like societal, like
they really are social constructs. That dreaded term. They are social constructs.
Exactly.
Yeah, true. Like you don't have to have two entry players. You could have one, of course. Yeah, you could. It's up to you how you choose to set up a team. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas like they might seem a little bit more like intended in a hero shooter, but it's still a really important part that unless you're playing a very extremely stringent role in a hero shooter, you will probably in different metas have to step outside of what your primary role is. So I would just be very curious to know like how many of those people had a CS background as opposed to being endemic to Valorant or coming from another hero shooter.
Sure.
Or like a MOBA, I guess.
I thought a way we could wrap up is like this. So, dusT, I have a question for each of you. dusT, for you, the question is this. Pick a player that we haven't really talked about so far who you think is just underrated. Who do you want to present if people are getting into Valorant? This is someone to dig your teeth into, or maybe it's not the most obvious name.
Ooh.
Or it could be someone we just didn't mention much if we just briefly touched over them, just someone who you fuck with this guy, you think he's good, or maybe people don't know.
Oh, we didn't talk about Penny much, but he's back in fight again. So I think he had like appeared at the end of last year.
This is from version 1, yeah?
Yeah, the Jet player. Yeah, I think that him getting back into fine form, as well as like the addition of Xander, is kind of what got version 1 back on track after a rather turbulent time after Vanity departed the team. And that's why they're so successful, in my opinion, as well as Zelsis being able to adapt into a flex player from having played a lot of duelists and sentinels in the past. So yeah, like Penny's back. And I think that is what makes version 1 a very powerful contender for playoffs. So I'll go with that one because we didn't talk about him at all.
Okay. And then for Geo, here's the problem, right? I don't actually know, because I remember when I did that interview with you, like, I actually might have given you too much credit for doing all those notes, because I'm just so used to people never doing their fucking homework, Geo. Like, once they get to the gig, basically, the joke is they just start turning up and then, like, quickly, just like for 2 seconds before looking at a previous match, like, yeah, I'm going to say, like, that guy's the best, but, they just start phoning it in on games. So you did tell me, though, you just have a bad memory as well. So I don't know how much is that you actually do love doing research, but, like, I have to say, when I genuinely do in esports, like doing research.
That's me, by the way. I'm the one with the terrible memory that needs notes to thrive. If I didn't have notes, probably like I'm done for.
That's why you do it as well, dusT.
I need notes, but in my case, it's like an actual legitimate medical problem. So
right.
I'm gonna.
Okay. Apparently, dusT also just popped that balloon for me. I also thought he was just really diligent. Apparently, he also just had a bad memory. He was just fucking putting all the notes there. Okay, whatever. But here's the question for you, Gio. One thing I love as a result, because I do enjoy doing research on topics I like, is I always love it when you just start. It's when you only just start the research, because you find something that's curious or interesting, the initial pull's there, and obviously there's all the mystery you're digging it. So who's someone you're digging into at the moment? Who's someone you're like trying to learn about or get to know more about? Is there a player? Doesn't have to be an NA one if you want. Just pick a player that's interesting to you at the moment.
Okay, so a player that's kind of interesting to me at the moment, I'm probably going to have to go with Ban from Knights. And the reason that Ban is interesting to me is because in the qualifiers, I was really unimpressed with him. and actually in the more recent games, I actually think he's I mean, as a team, they've definitely, Knights have looked a lot better, but I think Ban has also looked a lot better. And the reason that this is super interesting to me is because he's a Jet player. And usually, like, if you see a Jet player who is slightly below par, like, you're probably just going to discount them immediately because they need to be like up there. But for me, like, it's almost as if the coherence of the team, as that's gotten better, he has elevated as well. And again, Knights, I think, will probably be like first rounded in the playoffs. I don't think they'll get past the first round of the lower bracket. But he is someone who I'm very fascinated by, just to see if there is this upward trajectory and that's going to continue, or if like there's a peak and it's not going to go further than that and get to the point where we see people like leave or Asuna or Ye or whatever.
This video was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Travis Goff, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Toucan, William Peyton Lacy, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are? Maybe you want to take part in a lengthy donator discussion with me? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skilluminati today, where? Via the Patreon link in the description box.